Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in now, drawing the covers a little higher, letting the frets of the day begin to loosen and recede, letting the breath go out a little longer than it went in, good. Because the story I want to tell you tonight is one of the great life stories of the 18th century. It is the story of a woman who, by the time she was 20, was the most famous woman in England. And, as always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. By the time she was 30, she was perhaps the most famous woman in Europe. By the time she was 40, she had become a slightly tragic figure whom the pity of the London drawing rooms could no longer entirely conceal. By the time she was 48, she was dead, worn out by the accumulating costs of a life that had been, by every measure, exhausting in ways the 18th century world had not yet developed the language to describe. Her name was Georgiana Cavendish. She had been born Georgiana Spencer. She was the 5th Duchess of Devonshire, by virtue of a marriage that had been arranged for her at 17, and that she had walked into with the obedient cheerfulness that her upbringing had instilled in her. She had been, in her years of celebrity, a fashion icon whose hairstyles were copied from St. James's to Versailles, a political campaigner who walked the streets of Westminster soliciting votes for the Whig opposition, a hostess whose drawing rooms in Devonshire House on Piccadilly were the operational centre of the Whig party for nearly 30 years, a friend and correspondent of Marie Antoinette, a confidant of the Prince of Wales, who would in due course become George IV, a writer of one published novel and several minor poems, an amateur scientist with a particular interest in chemistry and mineralogy, a botanist of some accomplishment, a wife in a strange three-cornered household that scandalized London for 2 decades, a mother of 3 legitimate children and 1 illegitimate one, a gambler whose debts at the card tables of London exceeded the imagination of nearly everyone who knew of them, and finally a sick woman whose long final illness was the slow result of every kind of physical and emotional accumulation that the previous 31 years of marriage had produced. Tonight we are going to walk through her entire life. We are going to begin in the great house at Althorp in Northamptonshire, where she was born in June 1757 to one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in England. We are going to walk through the childhood that her mother arranged for her in the various Spencer houses of England and on the continent. We are going to follow her, at 17, into the great Cavendish marriage that her father had negotiated. We are going to watch her, at 18 and 19, become the celebrity of London, with her 3-foot hairstyles and her ostrich feather headdresses and her command of the theatrical arts that public visibility in 18th century London required. We are going to watch her, at 26, take to the streets of Westminster in the famous election of 1784 in a campaign of personal canvassing that was so unprecedented for a woman of her position that the popular satirists never quite stopped attacking her for it. We are going to watch the slow complications of her marriage develop, the failure to produce an heir for nearly a decade, the arrival in the household of Lady Elizabeth Foster, the strange long arrangement that the 3 of them constructed between them. We are going to watch the legitimate children eventually come little G in 1783, Harrio in 1785, the heir Hart in 1790. And we are going to watch the gambling debts that had been accumulating since her early 20s reach the catastrophic figures that the closing decade of the century would produce. We are going to watch her, in 1791 and 1792, conduct the disastrous affair with Charles Grey that produced the illegitimate daughter she would have to give up. And we are going to follow her into the European exile that her husband forced her into as the price of remaining married. We are going to watch her return to England in 1793. We are going to watch her, in 1796, nearly die of the eye infection that left her permanently disfigured. We are going to watch the slow diminishment of her later years. We are going to leave her, at the end, in the upstairs bedroom at Devonshire House on the 30th of March 1806, dying at 48 in the slow way that the worn-out heart of a long-strained life eventually produces. And we are going to look, briefly, at what came after, at the Duke's surprising grief, at the eventual marriage of Bess Foster to the widowed Duke, at the children's lives, and the long thread of descent that runs from Georgiana's family forward into the centuries that followed. It is a long life. It is the kind of life that the late 18th century occasionally produced when the particular collisions of class and ambition and beauty and intelligence and family expectation and historical accident all happened to converge on one person at the right moment. We are going to take it slowly, settle in. We have time. I want to spend a moment, before we go to Althorp in 1757, with the world Georgiana was about to be born into, because the world is one of the principal characters of her story, and it will help to have the scenery in place before the principal figure walks onto it. The world was Georgian England in the middle of the 18th century. It was a country of perhaps 7 million people, ruled by King George II, who would die in 1760, 3 years after Georgiana's birth, and would be succeeded by his grandson George III, who would reign for the entire substantive part of Georgiana's life, and would still be on the throne, by then mad and confined, when she died. It was a country whose political life was conducted by an interconnected aristocratic class of perhaps 300 families, who controlled between them the bulk of the country's land, the bulk of its inherited wealth, and almost all of its political offices. It was a country whose great houses, the country seats of the senior aristocratic families, were the operational centres of the political and cultural life of the era, in a way that is genuinely difficult for the modern reader to imagine. The great house was not a country retreat in the modern sense. It was operating capital, with its political business, its social entertainments, its agricultural and economic interests, its art collections and libraries, and its permanent staff of perhaps 50 to 150 servants. The senior aristocratic family that occupied the house was, in some real sense, the governing apparatus of the surrounding country, and the woman who in due course became the mistress of the house was, in her position, one of the most powerful women that the social arrangements of the era permitted to exist. The world was also, however, in the accumulating ways that the 18th century would gradually disclose, a world undergoing rapid and substantial transformation. The agricultural revolution was beginning to alter the economic basis of the great estates. The early industrial revolution was, by the 1770s, producing in the north of England the new manufacturing wealth that would in due course rival and eventually overtake the agricultural wealth of the South. The American colonies were beginning the uncomfortable disagreements with the metropolitan government that would, in 1776, produce the American Revolution, and would in due course transform the political imagination of the entire Western world. The French monarchy, across the Channel, was beginning the slow approach to its own catastrophe, which would arrive in 1789 and which would form the permanent backdrop to the second half of Georgiana's life. The print culture of the era was producing, by the 1770s, The new newspapers and the new political pamphlets and the new satirical caricatures that would change the relationship between the aristocratic class and the public attention that surrounded it. Georgiana, by accident of when she was born, would live her entire adult life in the middle of these transformations, and the shape of her career would be determined in important ways by the accidental conjunction of her own particular qualities with the particular new media and new political conditions of the moment in which she happened to come of age. Oh, let us go back. The Spencer family, in 1757, was at the very top of the English aristocracy without quite being at the very top of it. The family had been substantial landowners in Northamptonshire since the early 16th century, when the founding Spencer ancestor had made a considerable fortune in sheep farming during the period of the rising Tudor wool trade. The fortune had been steadily expanded across the next 2 centuries by a sequence of Spencer marriages and political alignments. By the early 18th century, the family had become connected by a particularly fortunate marriage with the great Marlborough fortune of the first Duke of Marlborough, the same first Duke whose palace at Blenheim was being built at exactly the same period, and a substantial portion of the Marlborough wealth had passed by inheritance to a junior Spencer line that would in due course become the senior line of the Spencer family. The result was that, by the middle of the 18th century, the Spencers were one of the 4 or 5 wealthiest aristocratic families in England below the rank of Duke, and the head of the family was a substantial figure in the parliamentary politics of the period. The head of the family in 1757 was John Spencer, who had been born in 1734, had inherited the substantial Spencer estates in 1746 at the age of 12, on the death of his father, and had been raised through his minority by his mother and his guardians. He had married, on his coming of age in 1755, Margaret Georgiana Poyntz, the daughter of an English diplomat and a woman of substantial intellectual cultivation and religious seriousness. Margaret was the dominant personality in the marriage, by the accounts of those who knew them. John Spencer was a kind man, somewhat reserved, with the unenthusiastic public personality that the wealthy heirs of substantial fortunes occasionally develop. He was not a particularly active politician. He was, in the affectionate language of his wife's letters, a husband who provided the substantial material conditions of the marriage, and who deferred, in most other matters, to the more decisive personality of his wife. The marriage, by every account that has come down to us, was a happy one. The two of them had married for love, in the unusual way that the 18th century arranged marriage world occasionally permitted, and they remained throughout their 28 years together, devoted to each other. The first child of the marriage, a daughter, was born on the 7th of June 1757 at Althorp. She was christened Georgiana, after her mother's middle name, with the spelling of the name that the 18th century preferred. She was, when she arrived, an exceptionally pretty baby, with the fair hair and the fair complexion and the bright, intelligent eyes that the various contemporary descriptions of her as a child consistently noted. She was, almost from the moment of her arrival, the adored centre of her parents' attention. The Earl Spencer for John Spencer would be created Earl Spencer in 1765, when Georgiana was 8, and would become Earl Spencer formally from that moment forward, was particularly attached to his eldest daughter in the affectionate way that fathers are sometimes attached to their first daughters when the early hopes of the marriage have not yet been clouded by any subsequent disappointments. Lady Spencer was equally attached, in the more way that her own dominant personality permitted. The two of them, between them, gave their first child a childhood that was, by every account, exceptionally affectionate and exceptionally indulgent, and the warmth of those early years would be, for Georgiana, the permanent emotional foundation that the rest of her life was unable to reproduce. The second child of the marriage was a son, George John Spencer, who was born in 1758, 15 months after Georgiana. He was the heir to the Spencer earldom, and would in due course become, in 1783 on his father's death, the second Earl Spencer. He was a serious and intelligent boy, with the personality that his mother's training had encouraged, and he and Georgiana were close from their earliest years. The relationship between them, the relationship between Georgiana and her brother George, was one of the permanent emotional anchors of her life. He was, for the entire 56 years of her existence, one of the people she was closest to. The third child, born in 1761 when Georgiana was 4, was a second daughter, Henrietta, called Harriet within the family, who would in due course marry the Earl of Bessborough and would become, like her sister, one of the substantial aristocratic figures of the next generation. Harriet's relationship with Georgiana was the closest of any of Georgiana's adult relationships. The two sisters, from their childhood at Althorp through to Georgiana's death in 1806, were each other's most constant correspondent, most reliable confidant, and most permanent friend. The Spencer family of those years, the parents and the 3 children, was an unusually close one, and the closeness would be one of the recurring features of Georgiana's life through all the subsequent difficulties that her marriage would produce. The childhood at Althorp, and at the family's London house in Grosvenor Square, and at the various other Spencer properties that the family circulated through during the year, was, by every account, a happy one. The children were given, by the standards of the era, an unusually substantial education. Lady Spencer was a serious and committed mother, who took the direction of her children's intellectual development with the particular attention that her own intellectual interests had developed in her. She insisted on the early languages, French and Italian by perhaps 8, with Latin for George and the more limited classical training that the era permitted for daughters. She insisted on the religious instruction that the evangelical seriousness of her own faith required. The family was Anglican, but with a particular emphasis on personal piety and daily devotion that placed them slightly to the evangelical wing of the 18th century Anglican spectrum. She insisted on the intellectual cultivation, reading, music, drawing, the accomplishments that the era expected of young women of position. She insisted, most of all, on the moral training that her own seriousness considered the foundation of any accomplished adult life. The Spencer children, by the time they were adolescents, were considerably better educated and considerably more thoughtfully prepared than the average aristocratic children of their era. The preparation was, in due course, both the foundation of their substantial achievements and the weight that some of them, Georgiana in particular, would carry for the rest of their lives, in the recurring sense that they were never quite living up to what their mother's severe expectations had been. The relationship between Georgiana and her mother was, throughout Georgiana's life, the most important relationship she had, more important, in many ways, than her relationships with her husband or with her lovers or with her children. Lady Spencer was the permanent dominant influence on her daughter's life. Lady Spencer's letters, and she wrote letters constantly, sometimes several a day, throughout the entire 56 years of Georgiana's life formed, for Georgiana, the constant background commentary against which she conducted every major decision and most of the minor ones. Lady Spencer was, in some way, the audience that Georgiana was always performing for, the judge being assessed by the permanent voice in her own head that no other voice ever quite drowned out. The relationship was deeply loving on both sides. It was also deeply complicated. Lady Spencer's standards were extraordinarily high. Lady Spencer's evangelical seriousness considered the worldly pleasures and worldly accomplishments of fashionable London life to be, on the whole, a snare and a temptation that her daughter ought to be resisting rather than embracing. Lady Spencer's constant correspondence with her daughter was, accordingly, a constant gentle pressure to be better than Georgiana actually was, to be more pious, to be more careful, to be more restrained, to be more like the ideal Christian aristocratic daughter that Lady Spencer had imagined raising. Georgiana, who was by temperament a much more sociable and much more spontaneously affectionate person than her mother had imagined, would spend her entire life trying and failing to live up to her mother's expectations, and the permanent gap between what she was and what her mother wanted her to be would be one of the recurring sources of her own self-doubt for the rest of her existence. There was additionally, in the conditions of the Spencer family's life, a feature that would become, in retrospect, one of the determinative facts of Georgiana's adult life. The feature was the social position the family occupied with respect to gambling. Earl Spencer, Georgiana's father, was a substantial gambler. He played at cards, he played at horses, he played at the wagers that the 18th century aristocratic male was perpetually entering into. He lost, by various estimates, considerable sums over the course of his adult life, perhaps several £100,000 in total, which in the 18th century was a sum of genuine consequence, even for a family of Spencer wealth. The losses were absorbed, on the whole, by the substantial Spencer fortune, and they did not significantly damage the family's position, but they were, in the daily life of the household, a recurring background fact that the children would have been aware of from a relatively young age. The assumption that gambling was, for the aristocratic class, a normal and expected pastime, that the losses were absorbed by the substantial wealth that the class possessed, that the suffering and the recurring debts were the inevitable price of the social existence the class led, was the assumption that Georgiana, who absorbed it from her father in the uncritical way that children absorb the assumptions of their parents, would carry into her own adult life with consequences that would, in due course, be considerably more catastrophic for her than they had been for her father. And the Spencers travelled, during the years of Georgiana's adolescence, more than the average English aristocratic family of the period. The Earl had a particular fondness for the continental spas, and the family spent extended periods at Spa in the southern Netherlands, at Aix-la-Chapelle, at the various German and Italian resorts that the 18th century English aristocracy circulated through. The travels gave Georgiana, by her mid-teens, a substantial European sophistication that the average English aristocratic girl of her era did not possess. She had walked through the picture galleries of Paris and Florence and Rome. She had heard the chamber music of Mannheim and Vienna. She had spoken the daily French of the continental drawing rooms. She had been introduced to the overlapping European aristocratic circles in which her family moved. She had, by 16, the European cultivation that her later position would in due course require, and she had it through the accident of her father's fondness for travel, rather than through the more deliberate preparation that other aristocratic mothers were arranging for their daughters at home. The consequence of all of this, the indulgent, affectionate parents, the close relationships with her brother and sister, the substantial education, the dominant mother whose high standards Georgiana was always falling short of, the assumed gambling, the European travels, was a young woman who arrived at 16 with an unusual combination of qualities. She was beautiful, with the kind of fair-haired, delicate beauty that the 18th century portraits of her invariably preserve. She was tall, by the standards of her era, perhaps 5'8", considerably taller than the average English woman of the period. She was charming with the natural warmth that her affectionate temperament produced. She was intelligent with the reading and accomplished languages that her education had given her. She was sociable with the instinctive love of company that her mother had been trying for years to discipline. She was also, in ways that her parents had perhaps not quite recognized, somewhat fragile, emotionally somewhat dependent, prone to the anxieties that her mother's high expectations had instilled in her, easily wounded by criticism, in the way that affectionate young women of perfectionist mothers often are. She was, in summary, almost exactly the kind of young woman whom the aristocratic marriage market of the early 1770s was going to find extraordinarily attractive, and almost exactly the kind of young woman who was, by virtue of her own particular combination of qualities, going to find the cold, harsh realities of an aristocratic marriage genuinely difficult to absorb. The catastrophe of the next 30 years was in some sense prepared in those particular qualities of the girl Lady Spencer was raising at Althorp. The marriage was arranged in the spring of 1774, when Georgiana was 16. The candidate was William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, who was at that time 25 years old. The Cavendish family was, in the hierarchy of the English aristocracy, one of the 4 or 5 most senior families in the country. The Devonshire dukedom had been created in 1694 for an earlier William Cavendish, who had been one of the principal Whig grandees of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and had been rewarded for his services to William of Orange with the elevation of his earldom to a dukedom. The family seat was the great house at Chatsworth in Derbyshire, one of the largest and most magnificent country houses in England, set in a substantial deer park among the Derbyshire hills, with the steady accumulation of artistic and architectural improvements that 3 generations of dukes had been adding to it. The London residence was Devonshire House, on Piccadilly facing Green Park, a substantial neoclassical mansion that the family had built in the 1730s after the previous house on the site had burnt down. The Cavendish fortune, which derived from a combination of agricultural rents and substantial mineral interests in Derbyshire and Yorkshire, was one of the largest aristocratic fortunes in England, perhaps £30,000 a year in the clear money of the period, with the substantial land holdings and the substantial inherited capital that the rents represented. The political position of the Devonshires was, by virtue of the family's Whig history and its substantial parliamentary interest, one of the more powerful in the country. The 5th Duke was, in the assessment of the marriage market, one of the most eligible bachelors of his generation, and his mother, who had been Lady Charlotte Boyle, and heiress in her own right, had been actively considering possible candidates for him for some years. The candidate was identified, in the way that the marriage negotiations of the era operated, through the overlapping social network of the senior English aristocracy. Lady Spencer and the 5th Duke's mother were on friendly terms. The introduction was arranged. The young people met. The Duke approved of the candidate. Georgiana, when she was informed of the proposal, did not, in the way of 17-year-old daughters of indulgent parents, raise any objection. The marriage was negotiated through the standard contractual arrangements that the era required. The settlement, the dowry that the Spencers would provide, and the jointure that would be settled on Georgiana for her widowhood, was finalized. The wedding date was set. The wedding itself, by the standards of the era, was a quiet one, conducted in the chapel of the Spencer House at Wimbledon Park on the 7th of June 1774, Georgiana's 17th birthday. There were no crowds. There was no public spectacle. The wedding was conducted in the way that aristocratic weddings of the period generally were. Georgiana and the Duke were married by the Anglican rites that the era required. They emerged at the end of the ceremony as the 5th Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. Georgiana was 17. The Duke was 25. The marriage that would occupy the next 32 years of her life had now begun. Now I want to spend a moment with the man Georgiana had married, because the husband is one of the principal figures of the story we are about to walk through, and the nature of his personality is the reason that the marriage developed in the way it did. William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire, was not a bad man. He was not in any of the ways that the era understood badness, particularly cruel or unfeeling or self-indulgent. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him well, kind in his own reserved way, intelligent in his own careful way, and devoted in his own undemonstrative way to the set of affections and interests that his life had developed. He was also, by the unanimous assessment of every contemporary who knew him and every biographer who has subsequently studied him, almost the worst possible husband for a young woman of Georgiana's particular temperament that the aristocratic marriage market of 1774 could possibly have produced. The mismatch was not, in any of its elements, dramatic. It was simply, in the accumulating daily way of these things, profound and complete. The Duke was, by temperament, exceptionally reserved. He did not enjoy the social entertainments the aristocratic life of his era required. He did not, in the daily way of married couples, engage in the affectionate exchanges and the thoughtful attentions that warm marriages produce. He spoke, when he had to speak, briefly and to the point. He was, in the assessments of the contemporary observers, one of the most silent men in London, a man who could spend an entire dinner without contributing more than a few remarks to the conversation, and who could spend an entire evening in his own drawing room without producing any evidence of the warmth that ordinary sociability requires. His pleasures were ones. He loved his hunting dogs, with whom he conducted, by the contemporary accounts, the most affectionate relationships of his life. He loved cards, which he played for substantial stakes at the various London clubs that the senior aristocratic males of the period frequented. He loved, in the way of certain English aristocratic men of his generation, the routines and the rituals of his own clubs and his own houses and his own daily patterns, and he was distinctly disturbed by any disruption to those routines that the social demands of his position occasionally imposed. He was, in summary, almost exactly the wrong husband for a young woman of Georgiana's affectionate, sociable temperament, and the daily evidence of his lack of warmth toward her would be, for her, the principal weight of her position throughout the entire 32 years of the marriage. There was, additionally, a shock that the early days of the marriage produced. The Duke, at the time of his wedding, had a daughter. Her name was Charlotte Williams. She was perhaps 4 or 5 years old at the time of the wedding. She was the result of an earlier liaison that the Duke had conducted with a milliner in his bachelor years. The Duke, in the way that the era's aristocratic males occasionally arranged such things, had decided that the child should be raised in his own household rather than in the obscurity that her mother's situation would have provided. He informed Georgiana, in the awkward way that such information was conveyed in the era, that the child would be brought to live with them shortly after the wedding, and that she, Georgiana, would be expected to take responsibility for the child's upbringing as a member of the Devonshire household. Georgiana, who had not been informed of the child's existence prior to the wedding, was, in the accounts of the period, somewhat shocked. She accepted the situation in the dutiful way that her 17-year-old training had instilled in her, and she did, by every account, treat Charlotte with the genuine affection that her own warm temperament inclined her to. But the surprising arrival of Charlotte in her household within weeks of the wedding was, in some sense, the first demonstration of the disregard that her husband would, in due course, show for her own feelings throughout the marriage. He had not consulted her. He had not warned her. He had simply made the arrangement and informed her of it and expected her to accommodate it. The pattern was the permanent pattern of the marriage from that day forward. The arrival at Devonshire House as the new Duchess took place in the days immediately following the wedding. Devonshire House, as I mentioned, was on Piccadilly facing Green Park and was one of the substantial London residences of the era. The house had been built in the 1730s by William Kent, after the previous Devonshire house on the same site had burnt down in 1733. It was a large neoclassical mansion, with a substantial garden behind it that ran back toward what is now Berkeley Square, with the main reception rooms on the first floor in the standard aristocratic London arrangement, and with the family's rooms on the floors above. The house contained, by 1774, a substantial art collection. The Devonshire family had been collecting paintings for more than a century, and the walls of Devonshire House contained the work of, among others, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Rubens, Titian, and various of the major Italian Renaissance masters. The library on the ground floor contained perhaps 15,000 volumes, with the substantial collection of early printed books and manuscripts that the family had accumulated. The household staff was about 60 servants. The whole apparatus of the great London house was, by every measure of the era, one of the most substantial establishments in the country, and the 17-year-old new Duchess walked into it with the bewildering combination of new responsibilities and new expectations that the position required. She did, by every account, very well. The careful childhood that her mother's training had given her had prepared her, in many ways, for exactly the position she was now taking up. She knew the languages, she knew the social protocols, she knew from the various continental and English country houses of her childhood the daily management of a substantial household. She had the natural warmth that her temperament had given her, which made her, almost from the moment of her arrival at Devonshire House, popular with the staff. She had the careful affection toward her stepdaughter Charlotte, who arrived in the household within weeks of the wedding, that her own affectionate nature inclined her to. She had, most of all, the instinct for sociability that the position of a great London hostess required, and within weeks of her arrival at Devonshire House, she was beginning to conduct, in the initial way that the early days of the season permitted, the entertaining that the position involved. What she did not have, however, was a husband who was capable of providing the daily emotional warmth that her own temperament required. The Duke, in the first weeks of the marriage, was correct in his manner toward her, but was not, in any meaningful sense, affectionate. He spoke to her about the management of the household and the estate matters that the marriage involved, but he did not speak to her about himself, or about his interior life, or about any of the subjects that intimate marriages normally produce. He did not seek her company in the hours that newly married couples generally spend together. He did not, in any of the recorded behaviours of those weeks, indicate any particular pleasure in her presence. He was, on the balance of the early evidence, in the same married state at 1 month after the wedding as he had been in his bachelor days, silent, reserved, devoted to his cards and his dogs, treating his wife with the careful courtesy that his upbringing required, and with no perceptible warmer feeling. Georgiana, who had not been particularly in love with him before the wedding, had nevertheless been hoping, in the way that affectionate young brides hope, that the marriage would in due course produce the daily companionship that her parents' marriage had so unusually contained. The hope, in the accumulating evidence of those early weeks and months, proved to be unfounded. By perhaps the autumn of 1774, when she had been married for some 4 or 5 months, Georgiana had begun to recognize, in the careful way that intelligent people recognize the disappointing facts of their own situations, that the marriage was not going to produce the daily warmth she had been hoping for. The recognition was, for her, the beginning of the long emotional difficulty that the marriage would represent for the rest of her life. She did not, however, allow the recognition to disturb the careful surface of the marriage. She continued, in the dutiful way that her upbringing required, to perform the role of the new Duchess with every appearance of willing competence. The disappointment was, by her own decision, kept private. The public position was, by her careful management, conducted with the public success that the position required. The public success began, almost immediately, to be considerable. The new Duchess of Devonshire, by the closing months of 1774 and the early months of 1775, was beginning to be talked about in London in a way that no other young woman of the era had been talked about for a generation. The reasons for the accumulating attention were several. She was, as I have mentioned, beautiful, and the kind of beauty she possessed was the kind that the era's portrait painters and public observers found especially compelling. She was tall. She had the fair hair and the fair complexion that the era's particular standards of female beauty especially valued. She had, in addition to the physical advantages, the natural ease of public manner that the position required. She was, almost from her first appearance at the public events of the season, comfortable in the intense visibility that the position imposed on her. She was charming. She was clever. She was, in the accident of her temperament and her position and her moment, almost exactly the kind of figure that the accelerating print culture of the 1770s was looking for. The London newspapers, which had begun by the early 1770s to develop the genre of celebrity coverage that would in due course become the standard feature of urban print culture for the next 2 centuries, found in the new Duchess of Devonshire the perfect subject for their new attention. They reported on what she wore. They reported on her daily movements through the London social world. They were not, in any meaningful sense, deferential. The Duchess of Devonshire was, by virtue of her position, expected to accept the new public attention as part of the public life her position required. But the attention itself was, by historical standards, unprecedented. Georgiana was, in the sense that the term would in due course acquire, one of the first true celebrities of the modern English-speaking world. The public visibility she possessed by the closing months of 1775 was of a kind that almost no woman of her era had previously experienced. She handled it, by every contemporary account, extraordinarily well. The careful theatrical instincts that her temperament had given her, the natural sociability that her childhood had developed, the careful continental sophistication that her travels had instilled, all of these combined into the public personality that the celebrity required. She wore the spectacular clothes that the position invited. She arranged her hair in the spectacular ways that the era's fashions permitted. She gave at Devonshire House the spectacular parties that the position called for. She was, in summary, a brilliant performer of the public role that her position had assigned her, and the public love affair with her that the London newspapers and the London public conducted throughout the second half of the 1770s and the early 1780s was, on her side, the effective cooperation of an instinctive performer with the audience that had been, in some sense, ready and waiting for her. The hairstyles that I mentioned earlier are part of the story, and I want to spend a moment with them, because they are the element of her early celebrity that has come down most vividly into the popular memory of the period. The hair fashion of the mid-1770s, in the overlapping French and English aristocratic worlds, was the enormous upswept hairstyle that the French had developed in the closing years of the previous decade, and that the English had taken up with enormous enthusiasm in the years immediately following. The principle of the style was that the hair was teased and powdered and arranged over a wire frame on top of the head, in a structure that could rise as high as 3 feet above the wearer's natural hairline. The structures were then decorated with the variety of accessories that the wearer's imagination could supply: flowers, ribbons, pieces of jewellery, models of ships and birds and other objects, and most famously the ostrich feathers that became, in the popular imagination of the era, the signature of the hairstyle in its highest form. Georgiana, who had enthusiasm for the elaborate possibilities of the style, became almost immediately one of its most celebrated practitioners. She wore the spectacular hair, with the ostrich feathers and the additional decorations, at the important events of the season. The public response was, on the whole, the public delight that such spectacular performances generally produced. The fashion, in due course, became almost universally associated with her. The popular term for the high feathered headdress was, by the late 1770s, the Devonshire feather, and the wide adoption of the style across both London and Paris was, in the contemporary attribution, substantially Georgiana's doing. The fashion celebrity was the first stage of her public career. The political celebrity, which would in due course overshadow it, was about to follow. I want, before we move to that political dimension, to spend a moment with the substantial daily texture of her existence in the early years of her marriage, because the texture of those years tells us a good deal about what the position of Duchess of Devonshire actually consisted of in operational terms. Her life was conducted throughout the year in a rotation among the principal Cavendish residences. The principal residence was Devonshire House on Piccadilly, where the family was in residence during the parliamentary session, roughly from late autumn through to early summer, with the particular intensity of the London social season concentrated in the months of January through May. The principal country residence was Chatsworth in Derbyshire, where the family was in residence during the summer and autumn months when Parliament was not sitting. There were, additionally, the various smaller Cavendish properties: Chiswick House, the elegant classical villa on the western edge of London that was used for the entertainment of the fashionable London circles in the periods between the principal seasons; Hardwicke Hall, the great Elizabethan house in Derbyshire that the family had inherited from the Talbot side of its inheritance, and that was used for the variation that the different Derbyshire setting permitted; Lismore Castle in Ireland, which the family possessed but rarely visited. The annual rotation through these residences was a substantial logistical operation that involved on each of the principal moves the movement of perhaps 30 or 40 servants, several wagons of luggage, the horses and carriages required, and the daily papers and books and personal possessions that the family considered essential to its ongoing life. And Chatsworth, of all of these residences, was the one that Georgiana came in time to love most. The house, which had been substantially built in the late 17th century by the first Duke, and which the subsequent dukes had been steadily expanding and improving, was set in a substantial deer park among the Derbyshire hills, with the River Derwent running through the park below the house and the Peak District hills rising beyond it. The natural setting of Chatsworth was, by every contemporary description, one of the most beautiful of any of the great country houses of England, and the daily life of the residents, the quieter and more rhythms of the country existence, with the absence of the constant social and political pressure that London required, was, for Georgiana, the refuge that her more difficult public life invited her to retreat into. She walked at Chatsworth in the substantial gardens. She rode in the substantial park. She conducted in the library the reading and writing that her intellectual life required. She spent in the hours of the country residence more time with her children than the London life permitted. She found, in the accumulated quiet of the country house, the forms of daily restoration that her more strenuous London existence depleted. The rhythm of life at Chatsworth in the principal years of her residence was substantially different from the rhythm at Devonshire House. The London rhythm was conducted in the intensive way that the season required: late nights, late risings, the social and political engagements that occupied the overlap of every late afternoon and evening, the accumulated exhaustion that the intensive social life produced. The Chatsworth rhythm was, by contrast, gentler. The day began earlier. The principal occupations of the morning were the reading, the writing, the attention to the children, the consultations with the estate staff that the management of the great country house required. The afternoons were given to the substantial outdoor occupations, the riding, the walking, the attention to the substantial gardens that the Cavendish gardeners had been steadily improving. The evenings were more private. I want, in addition to the account of the residences, to mention the particular relationship between Georgiana and her sister Harriet, because Harriet Henrietta Frances Spencer, who would in 1780 marry the future 3rd Earl of Bessborough, and would become, accordingly, Lady Bessborough, was, throughout Georgiana's adult life, the principal intimate of her existence. The two sisters were close from their childhood at Althorp, and remained close, with no substantial interruption, through the entire 49 years of Harriet's life, for Harriet would outlive her older sister by 15 years, dying in 1821 at the age of 60. The bond between Georgiana and Harriet was, by every careful reading of the surviving correspondence, one of the most affectionate sister relationships that the biographical record of the era preserves. They wrote to each other when they were apart, almost daily. They saw each other when they were in London at the same time, on the near daily basis that the geography of their respective London houses permitted. They confided in each other on every important question of their respective lives. They were, in summary, each other's principal confidant and principal support throughout the substantial difficulties that both of their lives produced. Harriet's own life, it should be mentioned, contained substantial difficulties that paralleled in many ways the difficulties of Georgiana's. Harriet's marriage to Lord Bessborough was, like Georgiana's marriage to the Duke of Devonshire, an arranged match rather than a love match, and like Georgiana's marriage it produced, over the years, the accumulating difficulties that unmatched marriages tend to produce. Harriet, like Georgiana, sought the emotional supplements that the failure of her marriage led her to seek elsewhere. She conducted throughout much of the period between perhaps the late 1780s and the early 1800s an extended affair with a younger man called Lord Granville Leveson Gower, the same Lord Granville who would in due course after Georgiana's death marry Georgiana's daughter Hario. The genealogical complication that the subsequent marriage produced, in which Hario married the man who had been her aunt's lover for the previous decade, was managed with the careful discretion that the social arrangements of the senior aristocracy regularly required. Harriet would also, in due course, have a son who would become one of the most famous figures of the early 19th century in his own right. For one of her 4 children was William Lamb, the future Lord Melbourne, who would in due course be Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister and her trusted political mentor in the early years of her reign. The connection between the Devonshire House circle and the subsequent Whig political establishment of the early Victorian era was accordingly conducted substantially through Harriet's family rather than through Georgiana's, and the substantial Lamb cousins who grew up alongside Georgiana's children at the various Devonshire and Bessborough residences were, in their adult years, among the most consequential political and literary figures of the early 19th century. There was George, who would marry Caroline St. Jules, Bess's daughter by the Duke. There was Caroline Lamb, William's wife, who would in due course conduct the famously catastrophic affair with Lord Byron that would be one of the defining literary scandals of the Regency period. The next generation of the Devonshire Bessborough cousins, accordingly, would carry forward into the early 19th century a substantial extension of the patterns that Georgiana and Harriet had established in their own generation. The 2 sisters accordingly walked through their respective adult marriages alongside each other, with the parallel difficulties that their respective situations produced, and with the mutual support that the extraordinary bond between them permitted. They were in some way each other's substantial lifeline through the difficulties that their respective situations imposed. The bond between them is one of the more affecting features of the documentary record of the era, and the letters between them, which have been preserved in considerable numbers and have been studied extensively by the subsequent biographers, are among the richest sources for the psychological and emotional reality of senior aristocratic women. Lives in the late 18th century. The political dimension of Georgiana's life developed out of the political position of the Devonshire family. The Cavendishes had been, since the 17th century, one of the principal Whig families in England. The first Duke of Devonshire had been one of the group of senior aristocrats who had invited William of Orange to take the English throne in 1688. The subsequent dukes had been substantial Whig figures throughout the 18th century. The 5th Duke, although he was not himself a particularly active politician, his reserved temperament was as little suited to public political life as it was to most other forms of public engagement, was the head of one of the principal Whig families in the Count, and Devonshire House, by virtue of his position, was one of the principal operational centres of the Whig party. The entertaining that took place at Devonshire House was, accordingly, not merely social. It was, in the way of the era, also political. The dinners and the evening assemblies at the Piccadilly House were the occasions on which the Whig leadership conducted the business of the party, the discussions of strategy, the negotiations between the various factions, the accommodations among the various leading figures. Georgiana, when she arrived at Devonshire House in 1774, walked into this political function of the household and almost immediately began to take it up as her own. She had, from her childhood at Althorp, a developed interest in politics. Her father had been a moderately interested observer of parliamentary affairs. Her mother had been a serious reader of the political pamphlets and newspapers of the era, and Georgiana herself had, by 16, the basic political literacy that the era's substantial education provided. She had, from her own particular temperament, the qualities that political hostessing requires: the warmth, the memory for personal details, the patience with the ongoing rivalries and resentments that political life produces, the tactful ability to mediate between the various competing personalities of any political faction. She had, most of all, the developing public position that her early celebrity had been giving her, which made her presence at the political dinners of Devonshire House an asset of the kind that political leadership in the 18th century occasionally found valuable. The principal Whig leader of the early years of Georgiana's marriage was Charles James Fox. Fox was, in 1774 and 1775, 25 years old, Georgiana's exact contemporary, and just slightly younger than the Duke. He was the second son of the first Lord Holland, had been educated at Eton and Oxford, had entered Parliament at 19, and had become, almost immediately, one of the most brilliant parliamentary speakers of his generation. He was charming, intelligent, broadly read, and possessed of the kind of charismatic personal warmth that turned the people who met him into devoted followers. He was also, by every contemporary account, one of the most disreputable and self-destructive young men of his generation. He gambled enormous sums and lost most of them. He drank heavily. He conducted in the public eye a series of scandalous love affairs with various women of the London demi-monde. He was, in summary, the kind of brilliant, ruined young man whom the conditions of the late 18th century English aristocracy occasionally produced, and the political career he was constructing in the parliamentary opposition of the 1770s was the redeeming counterweight to the accumulating wreckage of his life. He was a Whig of the radical wing of the party. He believed in the rights of the American colonies, who were by 1775 in open rebellion against the metropolitan government. He believed in the reforms of the parliamentary system that the radical Whigs had been urging for some years. He believed, in summary, in a series of progressive positions that placed him on the leftward wing of the political spectrum of his era. Georgiana, who met Fox at the political dinners at Devonshire House in the early months of her marriage, was almost immediately enchanted by him. The relationship between them, which would last for the entire 30 years that remained of Georgiana's life and would only end with her death in 1806, was one of the great political friendships of the era. It was, by every contemporary account, an entirely platonic relationship. Fox, although he was a man of considerable amorous appetite, was not in love with Georgiana in the private sexual sense, and Georgiana was not in love with him in the private sexual sense either. But the intellectual and political and personal affection between them was extraordinarily strong. They corresponded constantly. They consulted each other on every important political question of the era. Georgiana became, within a few years of the start of the friendship, Fox's principal political confidant and one of the most important figures in the Whig political organisation. She was not, by virtue of her sex, in a position to take any formal political role. The parliamentary politics of the era was conducted entirely by men, and the participation of women in the formal political institutions of the country was not on offer in any meaningful sense. But she was, by virtue of her position and her personality and her intelligent commitment to the cause, a substantial informal political figure. She organised the social life of the Whig party. She mediated between the contending personalities of the Whig leadership. She conducted, through her extensive correspondence, the private communications that the political business of the party required. She was, in summary, by perhaps 1780 or 1781, one of the most politically important women in England. And the culmination of her political work and the event that has come down most vividly into the popular memory of her career was the famous Westminster Election of 1784. The election requires a careful explanation because the situation it produced was unusual even by the standards of 18th century English elections, and the role that Georgiana took in it was the event that established her in the public memory of the era as the political celebrity that she became. The general election of 1784 was the political climax of a particular crisis that had been developing in the British government over the previous 2 years. The Whig leadership, including Fox, had been driven from office in late 1783 by King George III, who had used a series of constitutional manoeuvres to dismiss the Whig administration that he disliked, and to install in its place a Tory administration headed by William Pitt the Younger. Pitt, who was 24 at the time of his appointment, was the youngest Prime Minister in British history, and his appointment by the King had been in the constitutional understanding of the Whig, unconstitutional manoeuvre that had violated the parliamentary majority that the previous government had possessed. The Whigs were, accordingly, conducting in the spring of 1784 a fierce campaign to defeat the Tory government in the general election that the King had called. The focus of the Whig campaign was the constituency of Westminster, which was at that time one of the few parliamentary constituencies in England that operated on a relatively broad franchise. Most parliamentary constituencies of the era were, in the language of the period, rotten boroughs constituencies controlled by a number of wealthy patrons who could effectively dictate the choice of the Member of Parliament. Westminster, by contrast, had a substantial popular electorate of perhaps 12,000 voters, with the consequence that the contests for the constituency were genuinely competitive in a way that very few 18th century parliamentary contests were. Fox was the senior Whig candidate in Westminster. The contest there was, by virtue of his celebrity and the wider political importance of the election, the most watched parliamentary contest in the country. Georgiana, who had been a substantial supporter of Fox throughout the previous decade, decided to take an active role in his campaign. The role she took was, by the standards of the era, unprecedented. She walked the streets of Westminster, Westminster being, at this time, the streets and alleys of what is now the core area between the Strand and the Houses of Parliament, and personally canvassed the voters of the constituency for Fox. She knocked on doors. She spoke with the electors in their shops and their workshops and their homes. She handed out the Whig political pamphlets. She was, in the sense that the activity required, a street campaigner in the modern political sense of the term. The activity was, in the public perception of the era, simply not a thing that women of her position did. The women of the senior aristocracy did not walk in the streets. They did not engage with the voters of unfashionable London. They did not, in any recognisable form, conduct the public political work that was, by the assumptions of the era, the exclusive business of men. Georgiana did it anyway. The tactic she had decided on, and that her sister Harriet, who joined her in the campaign, supported with equal enthusiasm, was the direct personal canvass that the contest required. The two of them walked through Westminster, dressed in variations of the Whig colours of buff and blue, with ostrich feathers in their hats and foxtail ornaments on their sleeves. They went to the shops and the alehouses and the private houses of the Westminster electorate. They asked, in the charming way that their position permitted, for the voters' support for Mr. Fox. They were, by every account that has come down to us, extraordinarily effective. The voters they spoke to were, on the whole, flattered by the attention of two of the most famous women in England. The votes they secured were, in the narrow margins of the contest, substantial. Fox's eventual narrow victory in the contest, which he won by perhaps several hundred votes out of the total of approximately 5,000 cast, was, by the unanimous assessment of the contemporary observers, due in substantial part to Georgiana's canvassing. I want to spend a moment with the actual physical experience of those weeks of April and May 1784, because the experience itself was extraordinary in a way that the bare account of it does not quite capture. Westminster, in 1784, was not the Westminster of the modern visitor's experience. The grand parliamentary precinct that occupies the area today had not yet been built. The present Houses of Parliament would be constructed, after the disastrous fire of 1834, only in the middle of the 19th century. The Westminster of 1784 was a substantially commercial and substantially residential district, with the older medieval Palace of Westminster at its eastern end housing the parliamentary chambers, and with the surrounding streets containing the substantial mixture of shops, taverns, lodging houses, and private residences that the trade of the area produced. The streets were unpaved in many sections, narrow, often filthy in the way that all 18th century urban streets were filthy, and substantially populated by the variety of London tradespeople and shopkeepers and labourers whose votes the contested election was now requiring the candidates to solicit. Into these streets the Duchess of Devonshire walked, every day for approximately 6 weeks, accompanied variously by her sister Harriet, by various other Whig society women who had been recruited to the cause, and by parties of Whig political agents and footmen. She walked in the substantial pavements and unpaved streets that the route required, with the considerable physical exertion that the activity demanded. She knocked on doors. She entered the dim interiors of the shops and the workshops, with the various smells and dirt of the trades being conducted within them. She spoke with the electors in their working clothes, in their working environments, in the immediate physical contact that the electioneering required. She listened to their concerns. She remembered their names. She returned on subsequent days to follow up on the conversations she had begun. She conducted, in summary, the kind of physical, intimate electoral campaign that the modern reader would recognize as the standard practice of contemporary democratic politics, but that the senior aristocratic women of the late 18th century had never previously attempted in the way that the situation required. The physical exhaustion of the campaign was substantial. Georgiana lost, by every account in the surviving correspondence, several pounds in weight over the 6 weeks of the contest. She suffered, by her own description in the letters to her mother, from sore feet, from headaches, from the accumulating exhaustion of the early starts and late finishes that the campaigning required. She continued, however, to conduct the campaign through to its completion. The election finally closed on the 17th of May 1784. Fox was declared the winner. Georgiana attended the celebratory chairing of the successful candidate through the streets of Westminster. The traditional ceremony in which the newly elected member was paraded through his constituency in a specially decorated chair carried by his supporters, and was, by every contemporary account, a substantial figure in the celebrations that the Whig victory produced. The public attacks that I described earlier, the Tory caricatures and the newspaper accusations, continued, however, through the subsequent weeks and months even after the election itself was over. The Tory propagandists, who had found in Georgiana a target whose visibility made her an unusually attractive subject for their attacks, did not let go of the material the campaign had given them. The caricatures continued to be produced. The newspaper articles continued to repeat the allegations. The accumulating public damage to Georgiana's reputation was, in this subsequent way, a process that did not end with the completion of the contest she had been campaigning in. The damage was, in some substantial way, the permanent feature of the public memory of her case from that point forward. The canvassing produced, however, a particular storm of public criticism that was, by the standards of any era, extraordinary in its intensity. The Tory press attacked Georgiana with a ferocity that exceeded almost anything that the political journalism of the era had previously produced. The attacks took a particular form. They alleged, in various explicit and implicit ways, that Georgiana's canvassing had involved the offering of sexual favours to the voters of Westminster in exchange for their support for Fox. The story that became the most widespread, and that has come down through the popular memory of the period, was that Georgiana had given a kiss to a butcher in exchange for his vote, the butcher in question being, in some versions of the story, a tradesman in the Westminster shambles, and in other versions a generic representative of the popular electorate. The story was almost certainly false in any literal sense. There is no contemporary evidence, beyond the Tory satirical caricatures, that any such transaction took place. But the story, in the accumulating way of these things, attached itself to Georgiana for the rest of her life, and the Tory caricaturists, the most famous of whom was Thomas Rowlandson, whose political prints of the period were among the most widely circulated of the era's print products, produced in the months of the campaign and the months following it. Extensive series of obscene caricatures of Georgiana that depicted her in various embarrassing situations with the Westminster electors. The public attack was, for Georgiana personally, devastating. The caricatures were everywhere. The newspaper articles repeating and elaborating the allegations appeared almost daily. The public mockery, which had previously been, on the whole, affectionate in the admiring way that the public attention to her had been throughout the previous decade, became for several weeks of the spring and early summer of 1784 genuinely vicious. Georgiana was, by every account of those who knew her in those weeks, deeply hurt by the attacks. She had not, in any of her own understanding of what she was doing, considered her canvassing to be in any way improper. She was a duchess, doing the political work that her substantial political commitments inclined her to. She had not, in any sense, committed any impropriety. The public attack was, in this sense, unjust as well as painful. She did, however, persist with the canvassing. The instinct of her temperament was to continue with what she had started, and the tactical importance of the canvassing for Fox's narrow victory was such that she could not in any good conscience have abandoned it. She finished the campaign. Fox won. The political objective had been achieved. The price for the political victory was that Georgiana's public reputation, which had previously been on the affectionate side of the spectrum of public attention, was now permanently associated with the set of accusations that the Tory caricaturists had produced. The permanent association would, for the rest of her life, be the weight that her public position carried, and the content of the popular memory of her would in due course be substantially shaped by the allegations of those weeks. Hilful. The year 1784 was, in some sense, the high water mark of Georgiana's political career, and the way that the year ended with Fox's victory and Georgiana's reputation simultaneously vindicated and damaged was the demonstration that the political position of a woman of her era was, in the final analysis, an impossible one. She had succeeded in terms at what she had set out to do. The price for the success had been a set of public attacks, that no success could have made worth bearing. She had, in the bitter way of these things, won and lost simultaneously, and the permanent conclusion she would take from the experience was the recognition that the political activity she enjoyed could be conducted by a woman of her position, only at the cost of public reputation that no intelligent woman of her era could have considered worth paying twice. She did not, accordingly, repeat the street canvassing of 1784 in any subsequent election. She continued to conduct the political hostessing at Devonshire House, which was the more conventionally permissible form of political work for a woman of her position. She continued to correspond with Fox and with the other Whig leaders in the substantial way that her political commitments required, but the public engagement of the 1784 campaign was the high point of her public political career, and the lessons of it were, in the accumulating way of these things, absorbed. Through these years, while her public visibility was producing the spectacular attention that her position generated, there were two relationships of substantial importance that I want to mention before we move on, because the two of them, the friendship with the Prince of Wales and the correspondence with Marie Antoinette, give us the measure of the kind of celebrity Georgiana had become by the middle years of the 1780s. The feature of her celebrity was that it was no longer a specifically English celebrity. It was an international one. The fashion innovations she introduced in London were copied within weeks in Paris and Vienna. The political activities she conducted in Westminster were reported in the foreign newspapers of the European capitals. The substantial figure she had become was, by the middle years of the 1780s, one of the small senior celebrity figures of the entire European aristocratic world. The Prince of Wales, who had been born in 1762 and was accordingly 5 years younger than Georgiana, became one of her most devoted admirers in the early 1780s. The prince who would in due course become George IV, after his father's final descent into the permanent illness in 1810 made the regency necessary, was at this time in his early 20s, in open political opposition to his father, attached to the Whig party that his father detested, and conducting the extravagant social life of dissolute young royalty that the subsequent satirists would so memorably document. He was a frequent visitor at Devonshire House, where his Whig sympathies and his admiration for the Duchess made him a natural participant in the social life of the circle. The relationship between Georgiana and the prince was, by every careful account, an entirely platonic one. The prince's substantial amorous interests were directed elsewhere, and Georgiana, whose affectionate temperament was at this stage of her life still substantially focused on her marriage and on the accumulating disappointments of it, was not in any way romantically interested in the prince. The relationship was a genuine political and personal friendship between two senior figures of the Whig social world. It would last for the substantial remainder of Georgiana's life, with the prince in due course paying her substantial visits during her final illness in 1806 and writing the affecting letters of grief that the event produced in him. The Marie Antoinette correspondence, which I have already touched on briefly, was the more substantial of Georgiana's continental relationships. The two women had been introduced on Georgiana's several visits to Versailles in the late 1770s and early 1780s by the overlapping aristocratic networks that the era's senior continental travel produced. The affinity between them was the immediate result of the parallels in their respective situations. They were almost exact contemporaries. Marie Antoinette had been born in November 1755, Georgiana in June 1757. They had both married at extreme youth into senior aristocratic positions whose temperamental requirements they had not fully understood when they had been married off Marie Antoinette to the awkward and reserved future Louis XVI. Georgiana reserved 5th Duke of Devonshire. They had both, in the early years of their respective marriages, suffered from the problem that the marriages had not produced the heirs the dynastic situations required. They had both, in their respective ways, found substantial consolation in the fashion and social life that their senior positions permitted them to lead. They were, in summary, variations on a same theme. And the affinity between them was the small immediate recognition that their respective positions in their respective countries were substantially parallel. The correspondence between them, which began in the late 1770s, and continued through the subsequent decade and a half until Marie Antoinette's final imprisonment, was conducted in French, in the careful aristocratic style that the era's epistolary protocols required. The letters, which have been preserved in considerable numbers, contained the mixture of fashion gossip, political commentary, and genuine personal affection that the affinity produced. They sent each other fashion samples, bolts of fabric, pieces of jewellery, accessories that the two fashion leaders had identified as the most interesting recent productions of their respective national fashion industries. They consulted each other on the political questions of the overlapping European political world. They expressed, in the careful, affectionate language that the era's aristocratic friendships permitted, the small, substantial mutual affection that the parallel situations had produced. The destruction of Marie Antoinette by the forces of the French Revolution, which would in due course produce her execution at the guillotine in October 1793, was for Georgiana a private grief that the public events of those years had imposed on her. She was, in some substantial way, watching the destruction of one of her genuine friends. The horror of the situation, which the distance from France of the subsequent periods of Georgiana's exile would in some way mitigate, but would not in any substantial way eliminate, was one of the small, substantial private weights that the final years of the 18th century imposed on her. The woman with whom she had been corresponding for nearly 2 decades was, in October 1793, executed in the public square in Paris. The fact was, for Georgiana, the most personal of the substantial political events of the revolutionary period. Through these years, then, while her public visibility was producing the spectacular attention that her position generated, the private life of the marriage was developing the accumulating difficulties that I want to spend the next portion of the story with. The principle of the accumulating difficulties was the failure of the marriage to produce, in its first 9 years, any living child. The failure to produce a child was, for the marriage, a catastrophe of a particular kind. The principal purpose of an aristocratic marriage of the era, by the explicit understanding of every party to it, was the production of an heir. The heir, in the case of the Devonshire dukedom, would in due course inherit the substantial Cavendish fortune and the substantial Cavendish title position. The absence of an heir, in the absence of any alternative, would mean that the dukedom and the fortune would, on the eventual death of the 5th Duke, pass to the junior branch of the family. The Duke had a younger brother, Lord George Cavendish, whose son would be the heir presumptive in the absence of any direct issue. The direct issue was, by the standards of the era, the primary obligation of the marriage, and the failure of the marriage to produce any direct issue in its first 9 years was, by the standards of those involved, a genuinely serious problem. The medical history of the failure has been, in the various biographies that have been written of Georgiana, the subject of considerable careful study. Georgiana had, by the evidence of the surviving correspondence, perhaps 4 or 5 early miscarriages in the years between 1774 and 1783. The medical reasons for the recurring miscarriages have not been definitively established and probably cannot be. The medical evidence of the era is too to permit any definitive modern diagnosis. The effect of the recurring losses, however, was clear. Georgiana, who had been hoping with the accumulating intensity of the years for the child that the marriage required, was facing, by the early 1780s, the accumulating evidence that the children might not after all come. The accumulating disappointment was, for her personally, one of the principal weights of those years. She wrote to her mother about the recurring miscarriages with the sadness that the experience produced. She submitted, in the way that the era's medicine permitted, to the various medical treatments that the physicians of the era recommended. She did, in summary, everything she could to produce the child the marriage required. The child, for 9 years, did not come. The accumulating difficulty of the childlessness was additionally the occasion for the deterioration in the relationship between Georgiana and the Duke. The Duke, who had been correctly distant in the early years of the marriage, became, by the early 1780s, distinctly cooler. He spent more time at his clubs. He conducted, in the private way that the era's protocols permitted, a series of relationships with various women of the London demimonde. The evidence of the marriage's difficulties was, by 1782, sufficiently visible to the London social world that the private gossip of the period had begun to register it. Georgiana, who was at this point 25 years old, had been married for 8 years, had produced no living children, and was watching her husband withdraw further into his own private occupations. She was, in the private despair of those years, in a state of considerable unhappiness that the public brilliance of her London life was concealing, on the whole, but that her intimate friends and her mother were perfectly aware of. It was at this particular moment, in the spring of 1782, that Georgiana met Lady Elizabeth Foster, and the encounter at Bath in the late spring of that year was the event that began the long arrangement that would become, in due course, the most discussed feature of the marriage. I want to spend now a careful portion of the story with Bess Foster, because Bess Foster is one of the most extraordinary figures of the period, and the way that she insinuated herself into the Devonshire household over the months and years following that initial meeting is one of the more remarkable private operations of the era. Lady Elizabeth Foster was, in 1782, 23 years old. She had been born Elizabeth Hervey, the second daughter of the 4th Earl of Bristol, the famous Earl Bishop, the Earl of Bristol, who was simultaneously the Anglican Bishop of Derry, an eccentric and brilliant figure of the ecclesiastical and aristocratic worlds of the era. She had been raised in the unsettled Hervey household, in which the Earl's various enthusiasms and absences had produced a chaotic family life, in which his daughters had received less of the careful affection and careful preparation that other aristocratic daughters of the era received. She had married at 19 an Irish Member of Parliament called John Thomas Foster, in a marriage that had been arranged by her father with the minimum of consultation. The marriage had been, by every account, an unmitigated disaster. Foster was a difficult and possibly violent man. The marriage had produced 2 sons in its first 3 years, and had then collapsed in an acrimonious separation that had left Bess, in 1782, separated from her husband, deprived by him of access to her 2 children, for the legal protocols of the era gave the custody of children automatically to the husband in any marital dispute, and reduced to a marginal financial position that the allowance her father provided was barely sufficient to support. She had taken refuge, in the spring of 1782 at Bath, where the inexpensive lodgings and the modest social life permitted her to maintain a respectable existence on the means available. It was at Bath, in May of that year, that the Devonshires arrived for a visit, during which Georgiana was hoping that the medicinal waters might assist with her recurring fertility difficulties. The two women met. The instant attraction between them, on Georgiana's side, was extraordinary. Bess was beautiful, in a darker and more exotic way than Georgiana was. She was charming, with a kind of intense personal attention that produced, in the people who encountered her, a remarkable feeling of being especially noticed and especially valued. She was intelligent, with a considerable cultivation that her years at Bath had given her time to develop. She was, most of all, in a situation of genuine distress that Georgiana's own affectionate temperament responded to with the immediate generosity that her temperament always produced in the face of visible suffering. Bess told Georgiana, in the intimate conversations of those weeks at Bath, the detailed story of her marriage and her separation and her loss of her sons and her reduced circumstances. The story was, by every reasonable assessment, substantially true in its particulars, although it has been pointed out by the various biographers that Bess had a considerable gift for the selective presentation of her situation in the ways that her audience would find most affecting. Georgiana, who had her own private sources of unhappiness in those weeks at Bath, was profoundly moved by Bess's situation. She offered, in the instinctive generosity of her temperament, the immediate practical help that Bess's position required. She would write to her mother and her friends to find Bess a respectable position. She would, if necessary, take Bess into her own household. She would, in summary, do for Bess whatever a generous friend in her position could do for an unfortunate friend in Bess's position. The arrangement that emerged from those weeks at Bath, by the time the Devonshires returned to London in the early summer of 1782, was that Bess would accompany them. She would travel with them to Chatsworth for the autumn. She would, on a temporary basis, that no party to the arrangement quite specified, become a member of the Devonshire household. The temporary basis became, over the subsequent months, a permanent one. Bess accompanied the Devonshires to all of their principal residences. She was given a bedroom at Devonshire House, a bedroom at Chatsworth, a place at the family table at every meal. She became, by the closing months of 1782 and the early months of 1783, a permanent presence in the daily life of the Devonshire household. The complication of the arrangement, which the subsequent developments would in due course reveal, was that Bess's remarkable charm was working in the private daily life of the household, on both Georgiana and the Duke simultaneously. Georgiana had, almost from the first encounter at Bath, fallen into what we would now describe as an intense emotional attachment to her new friend. She wrote to Bess constantly when they were apart, in letters of extraordinary affectionate intensity that have come down to us in considerable numbers. She referred to Bess in the most affectionate terms. She invested in the friendship the concentrated emotional energy that her unhappy marriage was leaving without other adequate outlets. The friendship was, on Georgiana's side, by the closing months of 1782, the principal emotional relationship of her life. The Duke, on the parallel side of the same household, was developing his own attachment to Bess. The nature of the Duke's attachment was, by the evidence that has come down to us, somewhat different from Georgiana's. The Duke was not, in the affectionate emotional sense, in love with Bess. He was, in the more straightforward physical sense, attracted to her. Bess, who had considerable accumulated experience in such situations, and a clear understanding of where her own advantage lay did not discourage the Duke's interest. By some point in the closing months of 1782 or the early months of 1783, the Duke and Bess had begun what would in due course become a substantial sexual relationship. The relationship would continue, with various interruptions and various reconfigurations, for the entire remaining 26 years of Georgiana's life, and would only end with Georgiana's death. Now, this is, by any reasonable standard, the most remarkable situation that the Devonshire marriage produced, and I want to spend a careful moment with the shape of it before we proceed to the subsequent developments. The situation was that, by the closing months of 1782, the Duke of Devonshire was conducting a sexual relationship with the young woman who was, simultaneously, the most intense emotional friendship of his wife's life. The wife was aware of the relationship between her husband and her friend. The friend was aware of the wife's intense emotional attachment to her. All three of them, in the way that the triangle had developed, had agreed, without anyone ever quite explicitly negotiating the agreement, to live together in a permanent household in which all three of these conditions would simultaneously obtain. The term that has come down through the subsequent biographies for the arrangement is the ménage à trois, which is the French term for the kind of three-cornered domestic arrangement that the situation represented. The term is, on the whole, accurate, but it is also, in some sense, slightly misleading, because the quality of the arrangement was not quite captured by the French term. The French term suggests, on the whole, the arrangement of two women living together with one man as a kind of expanded conventional household. The arrangement at Devonshire House was something slightly different. The quality of it was that the principal emotional relationship was the friendship between the two women, and the sexual relationship between the Duke and Bess was, in some sense, a subsidiary feature of the principal arrangement, rather than its organizing principle. The affection between Georgiana and Bess was, by every account that has come down to us, the dominant feature of the household. The Duke's involvement with Bess was the subsidiary complication. The two women, in the psychological reality of the situation, were the primary couple, and the Duke was, in some sense, the accidental third party whose parallel involvement with Bess produced the scandal that the London world commented on, but did not, in any way, change the primary emotional reality of the household. The relationship between Georgiana and Bess was, by every careful reading of the surviving correspondence, the most intense and most affectionate relationship of Georgiana's life. The two of them wrote to each other constantly when they were apart, with the kind of intimate emotional language that the era's epistolary conventions made permissible between close women friends. They lived together when they were not apart, in the unbroken daily proximity that the household arrangement permitted. They travelled together. They consulted each other on every important question of their respective lives. The friendship was, on Georgiana's side, the permanent emotional anchor that her unhappy marriage had failed to provide. Whether the friendship was, on Bess's side, equally devoted, has been the subject of considerable subsequent debate. Bess, who was a more calculating personality than Georgiana, and who had her own considerable interests to pursue within the household, was perhaps not as wholly devoted to her friend as Georgiana was to her, but the friendship, even in its most cynical interpretation, was substantial and lasting, and it was the principal feature of both women's lives for the next 24 years. The London world had, of course, considerable opinions about the arrangement. The private correspondence and public satirical caricatures of the era contain extensive commentary on the Devonshire household and the role that Bess Foster occupied within it. The commentary was, on the whole, hostile. The assumption of the era was that Bess was a calculating adventuress who had insinuated herself into the household for her own material advantage, that the Duke was conducting a dishonourable affair with her under his wife's roof, and that Georgiana was a naive victim of the situation who was either too foolish to understand what was happening or too weak to do anything about it. The assumption was, by every careful reading of the surviving evidence, substantially wrong on every count. Bess was not in any sense a calculating adventuress. She was a young woman in genuinely difficult circumstances who had found in the Devonshire household a refuge that she was determined to maintain at whatever cost the maintenance required. But she was also a genuine friend to Georgiana, whose affection for her was substantially real. The Duke was not conducting a dishonourable affair under his wife's roof. He was conducting an open and substantially acknowledged relationship with a woman whom his wife had brought into the household and whom his wife was explicitly committed to evening there. Georgiana was not a naive victim of the situation. She was in the psychological reality of the household, the principal organising figure who had brought Bess into the household for her own reasons and who was getting, from the arrangement, the principal emotional support of her adult life. The Tory caricaturists who were inclined to interpret the situation in the most damaging possible way missed the psychological reality of the household by, in some sense, the entire substantive distance that the situation contained. The triangular household, having established itself by the early months of 1783, would continue in some form for the next 24 years. There would be, over those years, various modifications to the arrangement. There would be extended periods when Bess was not physically present at Devonshire House, when she was travelling on the continent, or staying with various of her relatives, or conducting one of the later separate phases of her own life. There would be periods of tension between Georgiana and Bess, in which the underlying jealousies and resentments of the triangular arrangement produced their inevitable accumulating frictions. There would be reconciliations, reaffirmations of the affection. The substantial pattern, however, would persist. The three of them, Georgiana and the Duke and Bess, would for the next 24 years conduct between them the extraordinary domestic arrangement that the late spring of 1782 at Bath had begun. There was, however, a particular turn that the arrangement took in the years 1783 to 1791 that I want to address now, because it is the period in which the dynastic obligation of the marriage was finally discharged, and the way in which it was discharged is one of the remarkable features of the household. The first child of the marriage was finally born on the 12th of July 1783. She was a daughter. She was christened Georgiana Dorothy Cavendish, and she would be known throughout her life as Little G. Her birth was, after 9 years of marriage and several miscarriages, the event that the marriage had been waiting for. Georgiana was, by every account, ecstatic. The Duke was relieved. The London newspapers reported the birth with the extensive attention that the Devonshire prominence required. The fact that the child was a daughter rather than a son meant that the dynastic obligation, the production of an heir to the dukedom, had not yet been discharged, but the simple fact that a living child had finally been produced was, after 9 years, an event of considerable significance. The second child of the marriage was born 25 months later, on the 29th of August 1785. She was also a daughter. She was christened Henrietta Elizabeth Cavendish, and she would be known throughout her life as Harriot. Her birth, like Little G's, did not discharge the dynastic obligation, but it did establish that the fertility of the marriage, after the initial difficult years, was now reliable. The dynastic obligation could in due course be expected to be discharged. The remaining question was simply when the son would arrive. Between the births of the two daughters, however, an event occurred in the parallel life of Bess Foster that complicated the household considerably. Bess, who had been conducting her relationship with the Duke for some 2.5 years by that point, was pregnant. The pregnancy was not, in any public sense, acknowledged. Bess, in the managed way that the situation required, departed for the continent in the early months of 1785 in the ostensible purpose of taking the medicinal waters and visiting her father at his ecclesiastical seat in Italy. She was, in fact, going to give birth in private circumstances away from the London public eye. The daughter she gave birth to in Italy in August 1785, at almost exactly the same time that Georgiana was giving birth to Harrio in London, was christened Caroline Rosalie Adelaide St. Jules. She would be raised in due course as a ward of the Devonshire household, with a fictional backstory that explained her obscure origins, the biological fact of her parentage, that she was the daughter of the Duke and Bess Foster, was an open secret in the Devonshire household, but was not formally acknowledged in any public document. A second child of the Duke and Bess was born in 1788, again in Italy in private circumstances. He was a son. He was christened Augustus William James Clifford. Like his sister, he would in due course be brought into the Devonshire household as a ward, and would be raised alongside the legitimate Cavendish children with the fiction of obscure origins that the household maintained. The fiction was preserved in the public sense, but the private knowledge of the actual parentage was extensive within the London social world. Bess's 2 children by the Duke were, by the standards of the late 18th century, an extraordinary feature of the household. They were, in some sense, the evidence of the reality of the arrangement that the Devonshire household had constructed. The heir to the dukedom, the son that the marriage had been hoping for, was finally born to Georgiana on the 21st of May 1790. He was christened William George Spencer Cavendish, and he would be known throughout his life as Hart, from his courtesy title as Marquess of Hartington. His birth after 16 years of marriage was the event that finally discharged the dynastic obligation that the marriage had been contracted to produce. The Duke was, by every account, profoundly relieved. The Cavendish succession was now secure. The purpose for which the marriage had been arranged in 1774 had now, finally, been accomplished. Georgiana was 32 years old. She had been married for 16 years. She had now produced the required heir, 2 daughters, and was sharing her household with the mistress of her husband and the mistress's 2 children by him. The shape of the Devonshire family in the year 1790 was approximately as follows. There were the 3 legitimate Cavendish children, little G at 7, Harrio at 5, Hart as the infant. There was the daughter of the Duke's earlier liaison, Charlotte Williams, now perhaps 20 years old. There were Bess's 2 children by the Duke, Caroline at 5 and Augustus at 2. There were the 3 adults, Georgiana, the Duke, Bess. The extended household, when all the children were in residence at Chatsworth or Devonshire House, included perhaps 6 children of various ages, 3 adult parents in 3 different combinations of relationship, and the substantial domestic establishment that the Devonshire position required to maintain. It was by any reasonable measure one of the most complicated households in England. It was also, by the assessment of those who lived within it, a substantially affectionate one. The children, by every account, were close to one another. The adults, by every account, were on substantially good terms with each other in the triangular way that the household had established. The arrangement worked. What did not work, however, was a parallel feature of Georgiana's life that had been developing over the same 16 years, and that by the closing months of 1790 and the early months of 1791 was approaching the catastrophic stage. The gambling had begun, in a modest way, in the early years of the marriage. The principal card game of the era, in the fashionable London circles in which the Devonshires moved, was faro. Faro was a simple game in its underlying mechanics. Players bet on the order in which cards would be drawn from a specially arranged deck. But it was, in its practical effect, an extraordinarily volatile game in which substantial sums could be won and lost in a short period. The game was conducted at the private houses of the senior aristocracy and at the specialised gambling clubs that London supported. The stakes at the fashionable tables were substantial. The evening's losses at an unfortunate session could run to several £1,000s, which in the 18th century, when an upper servant might earn £40 a year and a comfortable middle-class family might live on perhaps 300, was a sum of genuine consequence. Georgiana's gambling losses had begun in the first years of the marriage in the modest way that recreational gambling produces. By the late 1770s, the losses had grown. By the early 1780s, they had grown further. By 1784, the year of the Westminster Election, they had reached, by various careful estimates of the period, perhaps £20,000. By 1787, they were probably around 40,000. By 1790, they had reached, by Georgiana's own accounting in her private correspondence with her mother, somewhere close to £60,000. The figures by the standards of the era were extraordinary. £60,000 was approximately twice the entire annual income of the Devonshire estate. It was perhaps the equivalent, in modern income terms, of many millions of pounds. It was by any reasonable measure a sum that the marriage could not possibly absorb without substantial difficulty. The difficulty of the gambling was not simply the size of the losses. It was the way that Georgiana had been managing the losses over the years, which had produced by 1790 and 1791 a situation that was on the verge of collapse. The principal management technique she had developed was the careful concealment of the losses from her husband. The Duke had become aware, over the years of the marriage, of various of the recurring losses, and had on various occasions paid off the debts that Georgiana had brought to him. But Georgiana, who was genuinely afraid of the recurring confrontations that the revelations produced, had developed the habit of concealing the full extent of the losses and of borrowing from various small available sources, the sums required to cover the gaps between what the Duke had paid and what she actually owed. Clucker. The available sources had become, by the closing years of the 1780s, increasingly disreputable. She had borrowed from her friends. She had borrowed by the closing months of 1790 from the class of moneylenders that the era's fashionable society quietly used for the extreme cases of accumulating debt. The moneylenders charged extortionate rates of interest. The interest, accumulating on the principal, increased the total owed at an alarming rate. The situation by the early months of 1791 was that Georgiana owed, to various creditors at various rates of interest, a total sum that she could not, by any means at her disposal, possibly repay. The situation was approaching what, in the modern language of personal finance, would be called bankruptcy. The only question was when, and by what mechanism, the situation would finally come to her husband's attention. I want to pause here for a moment because the gambling itself deserves a more careful psychological reading than the bare account of the accumulating sums quite captures. Georgiana was not, by any reasonable standard, simply careless or reckless. She was an intelligent woman who understood in the clear way that intelligent people understand such things exactly what she was doing and exactly what the consequences were likely to be. Her continuing inability to stop was, accordingly, not a failure of understanding, but a failure of something deeper. The modern reader, with the accumulated subsequent understanding of what the medical profession would in due course describe as compulsive gambling disorder, can see in the surviving correspondence the symptoms that the modern diagnostic categories would identify: the cycle of brief euphoria at the occasional winning, followed by the accumulating despair of the more frequent losing, the irrational conviction that the next session would be the one that finally restored the situation, the persistent secrecy that compounded each previous lie, the kind of psychological reliance on the activity that no rational consideration could disrupt. She was, in summary, ill in a way that her era did not yet have the language to identify. The suffering she experienced in those years was, accordingly, not merely the consequence of a set of bad decisions, but the symptom of an underlying condition that no available treatment of her era could have addressed. The modern reader, in the subsequent reading of the surviving evidence, can see this fact more clearly than the contemporaries who knew her could have seen it. This is, in some sense, the darkest part of Georgiana's life that we have walked through so far, and I want to spend a careful moment with the psychological reality of it, because the suffering it produced is one of the features of her story that the popular memory of her case has tended to underestimate. Georgiana, in the closing months of 1790 and the opening months of 1791, was in a state of near-continuous terror about her accumulating debts. She wrote, in those months, letters to her mother and to Bess and to Charles Fox that have come down to us, and the letters contain the evidence of the psychological state that the situation had produced. She was, by her own description, unable to sleep. She was, by her own description, in a state of constant anxiety that no distraction could relieve. She was contemplating, in the most desperate moments of those months, the possibility that the only escape from the situation was the escape from her own life. The letters contain various references to the possibility of the escape that modern readers will recognize as the symptoms of suicidal ideation. The situation had become, for her, intolerable. It was at this particular juncture in her life that the affair with Charles Grey began. I want, before we go to the affair itself, to spend a moment with Charles Grey himself, because he is the principal figure of the next phase of the story, and the role he played in Georgiana's life requires the acquaintance. Charles Grey was in 1791 26 years old. He had been born in March 1764, which made him almost exactly 7 years younger than Georgiana. He came from a Northumbrian aristocratic family, the Greys of Howick, that was substantially less wealthy than the Spencers or the Cavendishes, but was politically active and substantially Whig. Charles had been educated at Eton and at Cambridge, had entered Parliament at the age of 22 as a Whig member for Northumberland, and had become almost immediately one of the most promising young Whig politicians of his generation. He was tall, dark, conventionally handsome, with the careful, intelligent manner that his aristocratic education had given him. He was a fluent and effective parliamentary speaker. He was a substantial member of the Whig political circle that gathered around Charles James Fox. He was, in summary, the kind of promising young Whig that the Devonshire House circle was inclined to cultivate, and he had been, from the early months of his parliamentary career, a frequent guest at the Devonshire House dinners and the Devonshire House evening assemblies. "Huh? The affection between Grey and Georgiana, which had been developing in the careful way that such affections developed, by the closing months of 1790, reached the point at which it became, by the standards of the era, an actual affair. The moment at which the affection became the affair has not been precisely dated, but the evidence of the surviving correspondence suggests it was somewhere around the autumn or winter of 1790 or 1791. Grey was, by every account, deeply in love with Georgiana. Georgiana, in the psychological circumstances of those months, exhausted by her accumulating gambling debts, increasingly distant from her husband, whose own attention was now substantially with Bess, in need of the affectionate attention that her own temperament required, was, in the way that the circumstances allowed, increasingly receptive to Grey's attention. The affair, by the early months of 1791, was an established fact. The affair was, by the careful standards of the era's aristocratic society, in some senses not particularly unusual. The extramarital affairs of the senior aristocracy were a standard feature of the era's social life. The protocol of such affairs was that they were conducted with the minimum of public visibility, that the parties involved continued to perform the public functions of their marriages with the full external propriety that the position required, and that the private indiscretions, when they were eventually discovered, were absorbed by the system without permanent consequence. The affair between Georgiana and Charles Grey was, in this sense, conducted in a reasonably standard manner. They saw each other at the standard social occasions. They corresponded in the careful coded language that the situation required. They met on occasions in the private circumstances that the affair permitted. The affair was, by the standards of the era's protocols, a reasonably ordinary affair of the kind that a considerable number of senior aristocratic women of the era were conducting at any given moment. The complication, however, was that Georgiana became pregnant. The pregnancy was, by the earliest evidence available, dating from approximately May or June of 1791. By the late summer of that year, Georgiana was in a state of considerable difficulty. She had, in addition to her extensive gambling debts, the new and substantially more serious difficulty that she was carrying a child whose biological father was not her husband. The two difficulties together produced, in the closing months of 1791, the catastrophe that became the principal turning point of her life. The way that the catastrophe unfolded was as follows. The Duke became aware, by some combination of the evidence available to him and the information that one of the members of the household had communicated to him, of the affair between Georgiana and Grey. He became aware, additionally, of the pregnancy. The three revelations, arriving at approximately the same time in the closing months of 1791, produced in him the reaction that the situation might have been expected to produce in any reasonably composed husband of the era. Extreme anger combined with a determination to take action, to manage the situation in whatever way his considerable powers permitted. The action he took was the use of the considerable power that the legal protocols of the era gave to husbands in such situations. The Duke summoned Georgiana in the closing months of 1791 and presented her with what was effectively an ultimatum. The ultimatum was the choice between two alternatives. The first alternative was that Georgiana would surrender the unborn child to the responsibility of Charles Grey's family, would end the affair with Grey permanently and immediately, would accept the conditions of public exile from England that the Duke considered necessary to permit the situation to be managed without public scandal, and would in due course, after a period of exile, return to her position as Duchess of Devonshire and resume her duties as the mother of the 3 legitimate Cavendish children. The second alternative was that Georgiana would refuse the first alternative, in which case the Duke would divorce her, would deprive her permanently of any access to her 3 legitimate children, would publicly disgrace her with the full force of his considerable social position, and would leave her to live out the rest of her life as a ruined woman, without position, without income beyond the minimum that her jointure provided, and without any subsequent contact with the children whom she had been raising for the previous 8 years. The choice was, by any reasonable standard, an impossible one. The Duke had, by the terms of the ultimatum, identified the point of greatest leverage that he possessed over his wife, her love for her 3 legitimate children, and had used it to force her into the acceptance of conditions that she would not, by any other means, have accepted. Georgiana, in the situation that the ultimatum produced, had no effective alternative. She accepted the first option. She agreed to surrender the unborn child. She agreed to end the affair with Grey. She agreed to the period of exile that the Duke required. She wrote, in the closing weeks of 1791, the letter to Grey ending the affair. The letter has not survived in any surviving form, but the subsequent correspondence between Grey and Georgiana indicates approximately what it contained. She told him she was carrying his child. She told him she could not keep it. She told him she would surrender it to his family, to his parents who would in due course raise the child as one of their own, and that she would accordingly never see the child or speak with Grey again. The affair was over. The child she was carrying would never be hers. She would, in the way that the Duke's ultimatum required, vanish from the lives of everyone involved for the period of exile that the situation demanded. The departure from England took place in the closing weeks of 1791. The composition of the travelling party was carefully arranged. Georgiana would be accompanied by her mother, Lady Spencer, who travelled with her in the role of supervising chaperone that the situation required. She would be accompanied by her sister Harriet, who was, by the accident of timing, also pregnant, although in Harriet's case the pregnancy was a legitimate one, the 4th child of her marriage to Lord Bessborough. She would be accompanied additionally by Bess Foster, who had insisted on accompanying her friend through the ordeal that the situation now required. The group of 4 women, Georgiana, her mother, her sister, and Bess, would travel together through France and Switzerland and Italy for the extended period of exile that the Duke had imposed. The timing of the exile, in the wider context of European history, was extraordinarily unfortunate. The group departed England in the closing months of 1791. The French Revolution, which had begun in 1789, and had been developing through 1790 and 1791 in accelerating ways, was about to enter the phase of its most extreme violence. The year 1792, into which the group was now travelling, would be the year of the September massacres in Paris, overthrow of the French monarchy, the year of the declaration of the French Republic, beginning of the wars between revolutionary France and the monarchical European powers that would in due course consume the next 23 years of European history. The group of 4 English aristocratic women, travelling for private reasons through the continent in the closing months of 1791 and the opening months of 1792, would find themselves in the middle of the most violent political revolution of the modern era, and the shape of their travels would be substantially determined by the accidents of where the revolutionary armies were and were not advancing at any given moment. The group spent the closing weeks of 1791 in Paris. Georgiana, who was at this point in approximately the 6th or 7th month of her pregnancy, attempted to maintain some appearance of normality in the fashionable society of the city. She visited the Tuileries Palace, where the French royal family, the King Louis XVI, and the Queen Marie Antoinette, and their 2 children, was now living under what was effectively house arrest following the failed flight to Varennes the previous summer. The visit to Marie Antoinette was a particularly affecting one. Georgiana had, throughout her adult life, been an admirer of the French queen, who was almost exactly her contemporary. Marie Antoinette had been born in 1755, 2 years before Georgiana, and who had been, since her arrival in France as a 15-year-old bride in 1770, the most famous and most fashionable woman in Europe. The 2 of them had corresponded over the years. They had met on an earlier visit Georgiana had made to Versailles. The visit at the Tuileries in late 1791 was the final meeting between them. The 2 women, both of them by the accident of their respective situations, simultaneously famous, and approximately the same age, and now both in the kinds of extremity that history was producing for them, sat together in the drawing room of the Tuileries and talked. The conversation has not been preserved. The scene, however, is one of the genuinely affecting images of the era. 2 of the most famous women of the late 18th century, in the moment of mutual disaster, sitting together in a drawing room and trying to conduct the ordinary courtesies of friendship, while the large historical forces that would in due course destroy them both were closing in around them. Marie Antoinette would in less than 2 years be executed by the revolutionary government. Georgiana would in less than 15 years die exhausted in her bedroom at Devonshire House. The 2 of them, in the drawing room at the Tuileries in late 1791, did not know in any way what was coming, but the shape of it was, by then, already approaching, and the meeting between them was the last civilized exchange between the 2 of them before history closed in. The group left Paris in the early weeks of 1792 and travelled south through the increasingly disrupted French countryside toward the south of France. The destination was Aix-en-Provence, where Georgiana was to give birth in the private circumstances that the situation required. The journey was difficult. The revolutionary disruptions had affected the road system. The inns were unreliable. The political atmosphere through which the group was travelling was increasingly tense, with the risk that any group of obviously aristocratic English travellers might at any moment find themselves the object of revolutionary suspicion. The group made the journey, however, without any incident, and arrived at Aix-en-Provence in the closing weeks of January 1792. Eliza Courtenay was born at Aix-en-Provence on the 20th of February 1792. She was by every account a healthy infant. She had Georgiana's eyes. Georgiana, by the accounts in the surviving correspondence, was permitted to nurse the child for some period of weeks before the moment of the surrender. The moment came at some point in the spring of 1792, when arrangements had been completed for the infant to be transferred to the care of Charles Grey's parents at the Grey family estate at Hawick in Northumberland. The infant was given to a careful nurse who would convey her, in careful stages, back to England. Georgiana watched the carriage depart. She did not see her daughter again for many years. The psychological weight of the surrender has been documented in the surviving correspondence with the evidence of extraordinary suffering. Georgiana wrote to Bess, in the days following the departure, in letters that contain the genuine evidence of the most concentrated grief of her adult life. She had, by the terms of the Duke's ultimatum, no alternative. The surrender of the infant was the price that had been required for the preservation of her position with respect to her 3 legitimate children. She had paid the price. The consequence was that she had now, in the actual experience of it, no comfort to be drawn from the fact that she had, in the abstract sense, made the correct decision. The abstract correctness of the decision did nothing to alleviate the concrete suffering that the decision had produced. She grieved. She continued, in the extended exile that the Duke had imposed, to grieve through the subsequent months and years. The arrangement that Charles Grey's family adopted with respect to the infant was the arrangement that the situations of the era often produced. Eliza was raised at Hawick by Charles Grey's parents, the General and Mrs. Grey, in the public understanding that she was the daughter of one of Charles Grey's distant cousins who had died in childbirth. She was raised accordingly as Charles Grey's niece rather than as his daughter. She had no awareness, throughout her childhood and her adolescence, of her actual parentage. She would not learn, until well into her adult years, that the woman she had occasionally met during her upbringing as the fashionable Duchess of Devonshire was in fact her biological mother. The concealment of her parentage was, in the standard way of such things, conducted with the full cooperation of every adult party to the arrangement. The cost of the concealment was paid by the two parties who had not consented to it, Eliza herself, who grew up not knowing who her parents were, and Georgiana, who lived for the rest of her life with the permanent absence of the daughter she had given up. The extended exile in which Georgiana and her travelling companions were now embarked occupied the remainder of 1792 and the year 1793. The group travelled, during those months, through the parts of Europe that the revolutionary disruptions still permitted. They went to Italy, where they spent the substantial part of 1792 in the relative tranquillity of Naples and Rome. They went to Switzerland in the early months of 1793, when the accelerating revolutionary violence in France was making any return through France inadvisable. They watched, from the distant European countries, the developments that the revolution was producing, the September massacres of 1792, the execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793, the declaration of war between France and most of the monarchical European powers, the beginning of the Reign of Terror under Robespierre in the later months of 1793 that would in due course produce the execution of Marie Antoinette in October of that year, and the several thousand other executions of the period. The psychological state of Georgiana through these months was, by the evidence of the surviving correspondence, the mixture of accumulating grief and accumulating exhaustion that the extended exile produced. She was missing her 3 legitimate children, from whom she was separated for the longest period of their lives so far. She was missing her surrendered infant, whom she now knew she would never see again under the original circumstances of their relationship. She was watching from the enforced distance of the exile the destruction of the European world in which she had grown up, the French aristocratic world that her childhood travels had introduced her to, the friendships with various continental aristocratic figures whom the revolution was now killing or scattering. She was, in summary, in a kind of extended grief that no available comfort could particularly relieve. She continued, however, to maintain the careful surface of composure that her position required. She wrote her letters. She conducted her correspondence with her political associates. She kept, in the extended exile, her practical engagement with the concerns of the life she was no longer present in. Duke, during the extended exile, conducted his own set of communications with his absent wife. He wrote to her, on a reasonably regular basis, in the careful neutral tone that his personality permitted. He gave her information about the 3 children. He kept her informed about the estate matters and the political developments that her interest required. He did not, however, indicate any desire for her return. The return would happen in due course, when the Duke had decided that the extended period of exile had been sufficient. The Duke, by every account, was in no hurry to make the decision. The arrangement at Devonshire House without his wife, the Duke and Bess and the children, with the calmer daily life that her absence permitted, was in some way perhaps more comfortable for the Duke than the return of his wife would be. He delayed the decision through the months of 1792 and into the months of 1793. The decision was finally made in the autumn of 1793. The Duke wrote to Georgiana, indicating that she might now return to England. The terms of the return were not particularly negotiated. She would resume her position as Duchess of Devonshire. She would resume her care of the 3 legitimate children. She would, on the understanding that there would be no repetition of the events that had produced the exile, be permitted to resume her previous life at the Cavendish residences. The extended grief of the lost infant and the lost lover and the lost European world would be carried forward into the subsequent years of her life as a permanent feature of her interior existence. But the external apparatus of her life would be restored. She returned to England in the closing months of 1793. The reception at the Cavendish residences was careful. The 3 legitimate children were brought to her. Little G was now 10 years old. Harrio was 8. Hart, the heir, was 3. They had been separated from their mother for nearly 2 years. The reunion was, by the accounts in the surviving correspondence, profoundly affecting on both sides. The children had grown considerably during the absence. Georgiana had aged considerably as well. The reunion was, however, on the whole successful. The mother and her 3 children re-established, in the subsequent months, the family relationships that the absence had disrupted. The wider household, the Duke, Bess, the additional children, also resumed, with the adjustments that the returning Duchess required, the previous arrangement that had been operating before the exile. The years following the return, the years between 1794 and Georgiana's death in 1806, are, in some sense, the years of her accumulated diminishment. She was not, by any measure, a broken woman in those years. She continued to function as the Duchess of Devonshire. She continued to participate in the political life of the Whig opposition. She continued to maintain the social position that her marriage had given her. She continued to be a substantial mother to her 3 legitimate children, but the quality of her presence in the world had changed. She was no longer the brilliant young woman of the 1770s and the 1780s. She was a worn version of herself, with the accumulating evidence of the costs that the previous 20 years had imposed. She had, by 1794, the kind of subdued exhaustion that the substantial private suffering of the previous several years had produced. The accumulation of that exhaustion was, by 1796, sufficient to produce a medical event that nearly killed her. The event was a severe infection of one of her eyes. The cause of the infection has not been precisely identified. The medical knowledge of the era was not, in this respect, sufficient to produce a diagnosis, but the consequences of it are well documented. The infection produced, in the first weeks of its development, an accumulating swelling of the affected eye and the surrounding facial tissue. The swelling became, in the weeks following, a substantial disfigurement that pushed the affected eye out of its natural position and produced a visible distortion of the affected side of her face. The infection then began to produce an accumulating systemic illness, a fever, a generalized weakness, the symptoms of what was almost certainly a severe bacterial infection, that in the absence of any effective antibacterial treatment was threatening her life. The physicians of the era treated her with the means available, the standard leeches and bleedings, the applications of various ointments and salves to the affected area, the administrations of the medicaments of the era's pharmacopoeia. The treatments were, on the balance, probably more harmful than helpful, but Georgiana, by the resilience of her constitution, eventually survived the infection. The recovery took perhaps several months. By the closing months of 1796 and the early months of 1797, she was no longer in medical danger. She was, however, permanently disfigured by the infection. The affected eye had been, by the extended pressure of the swelling, permanently damaged. She lost, by every account, the effective vision of that eye. The surrounding facial tissue had been, by the course of the infection, permanently distorted. The famous beauty of the previous 2 decades was, after the illness of 1796, a substantially diminished thing. She continued to look, in the reasonable assessment of those who saw her, like a dignified woman of considerable past beauty. She did not, after the illness, look like the spectacular beauty that her public career had been built around. The consequence of the disfigurement, in the psychological sense, was the further withdrawal that the previous several years had been producing. Georgiana, after the illness of 1796, became increasingly reluctant to appear in the public situations that her position involved. She wore, in the public situations that she did continue to attend, the head coverings that the accommodating fashions of the era permitted, with the function of partly concealing the disfigured side of her face. She conducted, in the subsequent years, her political and social work in the substantial way she always had, but the public visibility she had previously inhabited was, after 1796, substantially reduced. The marriage continued, through these years, in the triangular arrangement that had been operating before the exile. Bess remained in the household. The Duke remained, with respect to Georgiana, the civilly correct husband he had always been. The 3 legitimate children grew up. Little G, who was 13 at the time of her mother's illness, would in due course marry in 1801, at 18 a substantial Whig politician called the Earl of Carlisle. Harriot, who had been particularly close to her mother throughout her childhood, would in due course marry, in 1809, 3 years after her mother's death, Lord Granville Leveson Gower, who was, by the accident of the biographical detail that I want to mention in passing, the same Lord Granville with whom Georgiana's sister Harriet had been conducting an extended affair throughout the previous decade. The complication of the family relationship was managed with the careful discretion that the situation required. Hart, the heir, who was 6 at the time of his mother's illness, would in due course succeed to the dukedom on his father's death, and would, in his own subsequent life, be a substantial figure in his own right, a great patron of the arts, a substantial collector, the man who would in due course rebuild Chatsworth into the form that the modern visitor encounters today, and the man who would never, despite various attempts in his younger years, produce a successful marriage of his own. He would die unmarried in 1858, and the dukedom would pass to his younger cousin. The political work of the closing decade of Georgiana's life continued. Charles Fox remained her principal political associate. The Whig party, which had been substantially out of office throughout the period of the wars with France, was conducting in those years the extended opposition to the Tory government of William Pitt, with the focus on the questions of parliamentary reform, the abolition of the slave trade, the Catholic emancipation, and the various other reforming positions that the Whig party had been advocating throughout the period. Georgiana was, in the reduced way that her post-illness position permitted, a substantial supporter of all of these causes. She continued to host the political dinners at Devonshire House. She continued to correspond with the Whig leaders. She continued, in summary, the political work that had been, since the 1770s, one of the principal occupations of her adult life, the event that finally produced the political result that the Whig party had been working toward, came in early 1806, just weeks before Georgiana's death. The Tory government of William Pitt collapsed with Pitt's unexpected death in January 1806, and the subsequent political negotiations produced the formation of a coalition government, the so-called Ministry of All the Talents, in which Charles Fox at last became Foreign Secretary, the position from which he had been excluded for the previous 23 years by the opposition of George III. Georgiana, who had been working toward this political restoration of her principal political associate for a quarter of a century, lived just long enough to see it happen. The Ministry of All the Talents was formed in February 1806. Georgiana died on the 30th of March 1806. Fox himself, in one of the accumulating tragedies of the period, would die in September of the same year. The political restoration that Georgiana had worked toward was, accordingly, both achieved and almost immediately undone. The more substantial political work that the Whig position would in due course accomplish, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the parliamentary reform of 1832, the Catholic emancipation of 1829, would be accomplished by the later generations of the Whig leadership, with Georgiana long gone. The final illness of Georgiana, which occupied the first 3 months of 1806, was the accumulation of the various accumulated weaknesses of the previous several decades. She had, by 1806, the accumulated effects of the recurring fevers and infections that her 30s and 40s had produced. She had the accumulated effects of the ongoing emotional weight that the various private griefs of her life had imposed. She had, by every reasonable assessment, the kind of accumulated exhaustion that no treatment could relieve. The clinical course of the final illness was a slow decline through the months of February and March, with the accumulating weakness that the steady decline produced. She was, by the closing weeks of March, confined to her bed at Devonshire House, with the physicians in attendance and the family gathered. She lost consciousness in the final hours. She died, by the accounts of those present, peacefully, on the evening of the 30th of March 1806. She was 48 years old. The reaction to her death was by every contemporary account extraordinary. The Duke, who had been the principal unsatisfactory feature of her life for the previous 32 years, was, by the accounts of those present, profoundly devastated. He wept openly. He could not, for some weeks, conduct the ordinary business of his life. He confessed, to the various intimates who attempted to console him in those weeks, that he had not realized, until the moment of her death, how much he had loved her. The form of the confession is, in some sense, one of the most painful features of the entire story. The Duke had been, throughout the marriage, almost wholly unable to express any affection for the wife who would have been so substantially comforted by even the modest evidence of it. He had been, by the fact of his temperament, incapable of providing the daily warmth that the marriage might have produced as its ordinary output. He had only, in the moment of her permanent absence, recognized the affection that he had in fact been carrying for her all along. The recognition came too late to do her any good. It was, accordingly, the kind of late discovery that the substantial human history of the era is full of, and the tragedy of it is one of the recurring features of any careful study of the era's marriages. The public mourning was extensive. The London newspapers carried the extensive obituaries that her position required. The Whig political establishment lost, in her death, the principal hostess and the principal informal organizer of the previous quarter century. The senior aristocracy lost one of its most famous members. Charles Fox, who would in his own turn be dead within 6 months, wrote the affecting letters of grief that the relationship between them had earned. The Prince of Wales, who had been a close friend for the previous 20 years, sent the extensive condolences that his position permitted. The public mourning, in summary, was the extensive and genuine recognition that the principal subject of the public attention of the previous 30 years had, in the moment of her death, been removed from the public stage that she had occupied with such consistent presence for so long. She was buried at the Cavendish family vault at All Saints' Church in Derby, where the previous generations of Devonshire dukes and duchesses had been buried before her. The funeral arrangements were managed by the Duke. The inscription on her tomb gives her name and her dates and her position as Duchess of Devonshire. The inscription does not naturally mention any of the private features of her life that I have walked you through. The public memory of her, in the immediate years following her death, was substantially the public version that her position required, with the private complications managed in the standard private ways that the era preferred. The funeral procession from London to Derby was, by the accounts in the surviving documentation, a substantial affair. The coffin travelled by carriage, draped in the black velvet that the Cavendish funerary protocols required, accompanied by a substantial party of mourning servants and family members. The route through the Midlands was lined, in the market towns through which the procession passed, by respectful crowds who had come to see the final passage of the woman whose celebrity had been one of the features of their small national imagination for 30 years. She had been throughout her adult life one of the most famous private persons in England. The last journey of her physical body through the small Midland landscape was, in some way, the final public acknowledgement of the position she had occupied for the previous 3 decades. She arrived at All Saints' Church on the morning following her death. The interment was conducted with the careful Anglican rites that the Cavendish family religious sympathies had always preferred. The heavy stone of the vault was lowered into place over her. The physical apparatus of her life was, at this moment, finally and permanently set aside. I want to spend the closing portion of the story with what came after, because the subsequent developments are part of the full understanding of her life and of the patterns that her choices had set in motion. The first development was the marriage of Bess Foster to the Duke. Bess had remained in the Devonshire household after Georgiana's death, in the ambiguous role that she had occupied for the previous 24 years. After a period of mourning, the Duke decided to marry her. The marriage took place in October 1809, 3.5 years after Georgiana's death. Bess, who had been the mistress of the household for 27 years, became at last, in her late 40s, the legitimate 6th Duchess of Devonshire. The marriage was widely criticised in the London social world, where the arrangement of the previous 24 years had been substantially understood, and Bess was not, by every account, particularly welcomed by the wider Cavendish family, or by the Whig political circle that had been Georgiana's principal social context. She lived in her new position until 1824, by which time the Duke had also died and the dukedom had passed to Hart, who would as the sixth Duke be the principal Cavendish figure of the subsequent decades. The Duke himself died in 1811, 5 years after Georgiana, at the age of 62. He had been, by every account, considerably reduced after his wife's death, and the 5 years of his widowhood with Bess had not, by various accounts, produced any substantial improvement in his spirits. He was buried with Georgiana at the All Saints' Vault in Derby. The marriage of 32 years had ended. The 3 legitimate children pursued the substantial subsequent lives that I have already mentioned. Little G, the Countess of Carlisle, would have a long marriage and several children, and would die in 1858. Harriot, the Lady Granville, would have a similarly substantial marriage and would die in 1862. Hart, the sixth Duke, would never marry, would become the great patron of the Cavendish artistic and architectural inheritance, and would die in 1858, with the dukedom passing to his cousin's son. The line of legitimate Cavendish dukes that descended from Georgiana would continue through the junior branches of the family into the modern era. The current Duke of Devonshire, at the time of this telling, is the descendant in unbroken line from the 5th Duke and Georgiana through the subsequent Cavendish generations, the 2 illegitimate children of the Duke and Bess. Caroline St. Jules and Augustus Clifford were both eventually given the recognition that the adult arrangements of the family permitted. Caroline married, in 1809, the writer Henry George Lamb, who was the younger brother of William Lamb, the future Lord Melbourne and Prime Minister. Augustus, after a substantial career in the Royal Navy in which he rose to considerable seniority, was given a baronetcy by the Whig government in 1830 and lived a substantial life as Sir Augustus Clifford. Both of them lived in their adult years in the comfortable position that the Devonshire connection permitted. Eliza Courtenay, Georgiana's daughter by Charles Grey, had perhaps the most poignant subsequent life of the various children of the Devonshire household. She grew up at Howick as the ward of Charles Grey's parents, in the public understanding that she was a distant cousin. She was told at some point in her adult years, the moment is not precisely documented, that her biological mother had been Georgiana, and that her biological father was Charles Grey, who had now, in her adult life, become a senior Whig politician of considerable prominence. The revelation, by every account, was profoundly affecting. Eliza had grown up not knowing who her mother was. She now learned that her mother had been one of the most famous women in England, and that her mother had been, when she was an infant, the subject of the exile and the surrender that had defined Eliza's early existence. She married in 1814 a Captain Robert Ellis of the British Army. She had, in her subsequent life, several children. She lived in the private way that the subsequent management of her situation produced, a substantial and apparently happy adult life. She died in 1859. The line of descent from her through her children and her grandchildren continued into the subsequent generations of English society, in the absorbed way that such lines of descent generally do. Charles Grey himself, the father of Eliza and the principal lover of Georgiana's middle years, would in due course become the political figure that the popular memory of him most prominently records. He continued his Whig political career through the decades following Georgiana's death. He served as Foreign Secretary briefly in 1806 and 1807. He led the Whig opposition through the long Tory years of the early 19th century. He finally became Prime Minister in 1830, 24 years after Georgiana's death, in a Whig administration that would in due course pass the piece of parliamentary reform that the Whig Party had been working toward for the previous 50 years. The Great Reform Act of 1832, which was the Whig achievement of the early 19th century, was passed under Grey's administration. The Act, which extended the parliamentary franchise to a considerable additional portion of the male population, and which abolished the rotten boroughs that had distorted the political representation of the previous century, was the Whig achievement Georgiana herself had been working toward in the political dinners at Devonshire House decades before. She did not live to see it accomplished. The man who eventually accomplished it was the father of her surrendered daughter. The shape of the political history of the era contained, in the Grey premiership of the early 1830s, the late completion of the political work that the Devonshire House Circle had been conducting since the 1770s. Georgiana, in some sense, would have considered the accomplishment her own work as much as Grey's. She was, by the accident of mortality, not present to see it. There is, additionally, one further line of descent from Georgiana's family that I want to mention, because it is the connection that has made her, in some unexpected way, more visible in the popular consciousness of the late 20th and early 21st centuries than she would otherwise be. Georgiana's brother, George John Spencer, who had been the second Earl Spencer and one of the substantial figures of the Whig political circle in his own right, had several children. The line of descent from George Spencer continued through the subsequent generations of the Spencer family into the 20th century. In 1861, in the direct line of descent from George Spencer, was born a daughter named Diana Frances Spencer. She would, in 1981, marry the Prince of Wales. She would in due course become, by accident of her own circumstances and the media moment in which she lived, perhaps the most famous woman in the world of her own era. She would die in 1997, at 36, in an accident that the modern reader will not require any further description of. She was, by the genealogical reckoning, Georgiana's great-great-great-great-niece. The connection between the two famous Spencer women, separated by 2 centuries but connected by the unbroken thread of family, has been the subject of various small subsequent reflections in the popular memory of the period. The physical resemblance between the two of them, both fair-haired, both tall, both possessed of the kind of beauty that the public attention of their respective eras especially valued, has been frequently noted. The echo of the one life in the other has been one of the accidental features of the subsequent reception of Georgiana's story that the modern viewer of her portraits cannot help but register. I want to spend, before we move to the closing reflection that the life invites, a careful moment with a particular dimension of Georgiana's existence that the popular memory of her case has tended substantially to overlook. The dimension is the substantial intellectual and literary life that she conducted, alongside the more famous public dimensions of her position, throughout her adult years. Georgiana, who had been substantially educated by the careful program that her mother had arranged in her childhood, did not abandon the intellectual life when she became Duchess of Devonshire. She continued throughout the subsequent 32 years of her marriage to read seriously, to think carefully, and to engage with the intellectual and scientific developments of the era in ways that her public position permitted. She had, throughout her adult life, a substantial private library at Devonshire House that contained the principal works of the contemporary literature and philosophy. She corresponded in the substantial way that the era's epistolary culture permitted with various of the intellectual figures of the period. She subscribed to the principal periodicals. She maintained, in summary, the substantial intellectual engagement that her considerable intelligence required. She was also, by the accident of her temperament, drawn to the natural sciences with a particular interest. She studied, with the careful attention that her temperament could produce, both botany and mineralogy. She conducted, at Chatsworth in the periods of her residence there, the scientific investigations that the new instruments and developing methods of the era permitted. She accumulated, over the years, a substantial private collection of mineralogical specimens that the subsequent generations of the Cavendish family preserved, and that became in due course one of the substantial scientific holdings of the family. She corresponded on scientific questions with various of the senior scientific figures of the era, among them the great chemist Henry Cavendish, who was a distant cousin of the Duke, and one of the principal scientific figures of the late 18th century. The scientific work that Henry Cavendish was conducting in those years, the experimental investigations that would in due course establish the composition of water and the properties of various of the newly discovered gases, was substantially suppo, in the practical financial sense, by the Devonshire family connection, and Georgiana's own interest in the scientific questions made her one of the Cavendish figures who took an interest in his work. She wrote in the periods of her life that the various interruptions permitted, both in prose and in verse. She published, anonymously, a novel in 1779, when she was 22, a epistolary novel called The Sylph, which was the fashionable form of the era, and which dealt, in the fictional way that the situation required, with the predicament of a young woman of considerable beauty and considerable wealth, who is married to an unsuitable husband and is drawn into the dangerous temptations of fashionable London life. The autobiographical dimension of the novel was, by the reading of the subsequent biographers, fairly evident, and the contemporary readers who suspected that the anonymous author might be the new young Duchess of Devonshire were, on the evidence available, substantially correct. The novel was a modest commercial success in its first publication. It was reprinted several times over the subsequent decades. It is, in some sense, the literary record of the early Georgiana before the subsequent complications of her life closed in around her. She wrote, in addition to the novel, a substantial body of private verse poems addressed to her children, poems about the natural landscapes of Chatsworth, poems about the emotional concerns of her private life. The verse was not generally published in her lifetime, but samples of it have come down through the subsequent biographies, and the quality of it indicates, on the balance, an accomplished amateur writer rather than a significant literary figure. The body of work, however, is one of the additional features of her life that the popular memory of her case has tended to overlook. There was additionally the Devonshire House circle that Georgiana presided over throughout her adult life, and that was, by the reckoning of the various subsequent cultural histories of the era, one of the principal cultural centres of Whig London. The circle that gathered at Devonshire House and at the associated townhouses of the Whig leadership where the principal figures circulated included not merely the political figures I have already mentioned, but also the principal literary and dramatic figures of the Whig sympathies. The playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan was an intimate of the circle. The philosophers and orators, Edmund Burke and his various associates, were frequent participants. The actresses and the painters and the small new newspaper editors who contributed to the Whig political effort were all, in their various ways, attached to the circle. The cultural life of Whig London in the last quarter of the 18th century was, in some substantial way, organised around the Devonshire House circle, and Georgiana was, by virtue of her position and her qualities, the organising figure of it. She was not, by the standards of the era, an intellectual figure in her own right, in the same sense that the principal philosophers and writers of the circle were, but she was, in the function of intellectual hostess, one of the most substantial figures of the late 18th century English cultural world, and the contribution she made to the intellectual life of the era was, in the way that hostessing makes such contributions, considerable. The dimension of her life that I want to mention briefly before turning to the closing reflection is her relationship with her mother through the later years of the marriage. Lady Spencer, who had been the dominant influence on Georgiana's childhood and the constant presence in her adult correspondence, lived a remarkably long life. She survived her own husband, the first Earl Spencer, who died in 1783 by 31 years. She survived her son George, who became the second Earl, until 1814 when she herself died at the age of 76. She outlived her famous daughter Georgiana by 8 years. The relationship between Lady Spencer and Georgiana through the adult years was, as I mentioned earlier, the most important relationship of Georgiana's life. It was also, in some sense, the relationship that had done her the most damage. Lady Spencer's evangelical seriousness had instilled in her daughter the kind of permanent self-reproach that the accumulating complications of the adult marriage had only intensified. Lady Spencer was, throughout the adult years, a constant commentator on her daughter's choices, with the commentary tending substantially to the disapproving end of the available range. The gambling, in particular, was the subject of the most extensive maternal commentary, with the letters from Lady Spencer to her daughter through the late 1780s and early 1790s, containing the accumulating horrified accounts of her reactions to the successive revelations of the accumulating debts. The Charles Grey affair, when it eventually became known to Lady Spencer in late 1791, produced the most extreme of the maternal reactions. Lady Spencer was, by the evidence of the surviving correspondence, almost more devastated by the situation than the Duke himself. The enforced exile which Lady Spencer accompanied her daughter through was, on the balance, more punishment than support, with Lady Spencer's constant disappointed presence functioning, for Georgiana, as the additional weight that the situation hardly required. And yet, beneath all of the accumulating disappointment and the accumulating reproach, the relationship between Lady Spencer and Georgiana was, by every reading of the surviving correspondence, fundamentally one of profound mutual love. The two of them, in the constant letters across the 32 years of the marriage, sustained the small constant communication that the love required. Lady Spencer was, in the final illness of 1806, present at her daughter's bedside through the closing weeks. She held her daughter's hand at the moment of her death. She wrote in the subsequent weeks the letters of grief that the death produced in her with the intensity that made clear the depth of her affection. The relationship between Lady Spencer and Georgiana was, in this final reckoning, the kind of complicated and permanent love that the relationships between mothers and daughters most often actually are. I want to spend, before we close, a careful moment with the larger meaning of the life we have walked through, because the life is, in its particular way, one of the representative cases of a particular set of historical conditions, and the representative quality of it gives the individual story a slightly larger significance than the individual story alone would carry. The conditions are the conditions of the late 18th century English aristocratic marriage conducted under the social and legal arrangements of the era. The arrangements gave to the senior aristocratic woman a set of advantages that almost no other women of her time enjoyed. The substantial wealth, the substantial position, the considerable freedom of daily action that the position permitted, the small, substantial education that the mothers of the position generally arranged for their daughters. The arrangements also gave to the same women a set of constraints that the substantial advantages did not, in any way, fully compensate for. The principle of the constraints was the terms of the marriage itself, which placed the woman of the senior aristocratic position in a situation in which her most important life decisions had been made for her by her parents, in which her daily existence was conducted in the constant presence of a husband whom she had not chosen, in which her principal social function was the production of an heir, and in which her psychological and emotional needs were, by the assumptions of the era, considered substantially secondary to the dynastic and financial purposes of the marriage. The situation of an aristocratic woman of the era was accordingly one in which the substantial external advantages of her position coexisted with the substantial internal constraints that the marriage arrangements imposed. Some of the women of the era's senior aristocratic marriages found that the external advantages were, on the balance, more substantial than the internal constraints, and they conducted, in their cases, lives that were on the balance happy and on the balance fulfilling. The outcome depended, in the way of these things, on the accidents of personality and circumstance, on the temperament of the woman in question, the husband her parents had chosen for her, on the match or mismatch between the two temperaments, on the events that the subsequent decades happened to throw at the marriage. Georgiana's case was, in this spectrum, an unusually difficult one. The mismatch between her temperament and the temperament of the husband her parents had chosen for her was, by every reasonable assessment, almost complete. She was warm. He was reserved. She was sociable. He was withdrawn. She was emotionally needy in the way that affectionate young women of overbearing mothers often are. He was emotionally unable to provide the substantial affectionate response that her needs required. The marriage was, on the level of daily emotional exchange, a disaster from its first day. The way that Georgiana managed the disaster over the subsequent 32 years was the way that determined the shape of her life. She managed it, on the whole, by constructing around herself a substantial alternative emotional life that the failure of the marriage had left her free to construct. The alternative emotional life was, in its principal feature, the intense friendship with Bess Foster that occupied the principal share of her adult emotional energy. It was, in its subsidiary features, the set of political and intellectual friendships with Charles Fox, with Sheridan, with the wider Devonshire House circle, that gave her the daily intellectual companionship that her marriage was not providing. It was, in its dangerous features, the affair with Charles Grey that produced the catastrophe of 1791 and 1792. It was, in its destructive features, the gambling that produced the accumulating financial disaster of the same period. The substantial alternative emotional life that Georgiana constructed for herself was, in summary, the mixture of productive and destructive elements that the situation tended to produce. The productive elements made her, on the balance, a more interesting and more accomplished woman than she would have been in a more ordinary and more conventional marriage. The destructive elements caused her, on the balance, the substantial suffering that her life accumulated. What did her life mean? What does the long arc of her existence from Althorp in 1757 to Devonshire House in 1806 actually tell us about the historical conditions she inhabited, and about the question of what a person can do with a life that has been, in so many ways, shaped by forces outside her own control? The answer that her life seems to me to suggest is, in the careful way of these things, an answer that requires us to hold several things in mind simultaneously. The first thing is that Georgiana was, by every reasonable assessment, a genuinely talented and genuinely substantial woman whose contributions to the political, social, and intellectual life of her era were, in their way, considerable. She was not merely a fashionable celebrity, although she was that. She was a substantial political organizer whose contributions to the Whig political effort over 30 years were among the most consequential contributions any woman of the era made. She was a substantial intellectual figure whose private writing and private scientific interests were, in the limited way that her position permitted, genuine. She was a substantial mother to her 4 children, 3 legitimate and 1 surrendered, whose affectionate engagement with each of them was, in the letters that have come down to us, profoundly real. She was, in summary, a considerable person whose accomplishments were, even after the complications of her life are taken fully into account, substantial. The second thing is that her life was, in its shape, simultaneously her own and not her own. The decisions that defined the overall arc of her existence, the marriage at 17, the subsequent submission to the terms of the marriage, the exile of 1791 to 1793, the surrender of her daughter Eliza, were not, by any reasonable assessment, decisions that she had freely made. They were decisions that had been imposed on her by the institutional arrangements of her era, and by the people, her parents, her husband, who had been authorized by the institutional arrangements to make the decisions on her behalf. She accepted the decisions in the way that the institutional arrangements required of her, but the accepting of them was not the same thing as the making of them. She lived a life that was in its fundamental shape, not the life she would have chosen if the institutional arrangements had permitted her to choose. Within the shape of the life that had been chosen for her, she conducted, with substantial intelligence and substantial effort, the work of constructing a life that was, on the balance, worth living. The construction was, in some substantial way, her real achievement. The third thing is the price that the construction cost her. Georgiana was, by every reasonable assessment, exhausted by her life. She died at 48, which was, by the standards of the era, unusually young. The life expectancy of the senior aristocratic women of the period was perhaps in the 50s or 60s, but it was younger than it might have been if the accumulating private suffering of the previous several decades had not worn her out. The gambling debts had cost her over the years the psychological energy that no substantial alternative recovery could replace. The Charles Grey affair had cost her the daughter she would never see again. The exile had cost her the 2 years of her children's lives that she could not recover. The eye infection had cost her the substantial physical beauty that her public position had been built around. The accumulation of all of these costs was, by the reckoning of her own body, the weight that the final illness of 1806 was unable to support. I want to leave you with the image that I think captures her best. It is not the image of the fashionable young Duchess of the late 1770s, with her spectacular feathered headdresses and her spectacular London entertainments, although that is the image that the popular memory of her case has tended substantially to fixate on. It is not the image of the political celebrity of the Westminster Election of 1784, although that is the image of her most prominent public engagement. It is the image of Georgiana in some evening of perhaps 1798 or 1799, 2 or 3 years after the eye infection of 1796, when the disfigurement was no longer a recent shock, but had become a permanent feature of her daily existence. She is in her private sitting room at Chatsworth. She is perhaps 40 years old. She has on her lap one of her reading projects of those years, perhaps a volume of botanical illustrations, poetry. Her 3 children, little G now 16, Harry-O now 14, Hart now 8, are in the house with her, at various points of evening occupation. Bess is in another room, at her own evening occupation. The Duke is at his clubs in London, or at one of the other Cavendish residences. The evening is quiet. The fire is in the grate. Georgiana sits in the composure that the accumulating substantial experience of her 40 years has produced. She is no longer the spectacular young woman she was. She is also no longer in the extreme distress that the several years before the eye infection produced. She is in the late middle stage of her life, when the accumulated experience has produced, in her, the kind of mature equilibrium that the substantial private suffering of the previous decades has by some alchemy produced. She has lost a great deal. She is, in the evening at Chatsworth in some year of the late 1790s, the woman that the previous 40 years have made her. The cage in which her life was conducted has been substantial. The accumulated productive use she has made of the space within the cage has been, in the way of these things, also substantial. The image of her, in the evening at Chatsworth, is the image of a substantial person whose substantial life has, despite everything, been worth conducting. The story I have walked you through tonight is one of the great life stories of the late 18th century. It is the story of a woman whose life began in a position of immense privilege and immense constraint, who was married at 17 to a husband she had not chosen, who managed the consequences of the marriage with the intelligence and effort that her character permitted, who suffered the catastrophes that her situation produced, who built around the failure of her marriage the alternative emotional and political and intellectual life that gave her existence its substantial content, who paid the accumulating small price that the life required, who died at 48 in the worn-out way that the accumulating small price eventually produced, and who was buried in the way that the institutional arrangements of her era required, with her husband at the Cavendish family vault. The life is long. Sleep well. Georgiana, 5th Duchess of Devonshire, lies buried at the Cavendish family vault at All Saints' Church in Derby. Her dates are 1757 to 1806. Her accumulated small contributions to the political and social and intellectual life of her era are, in the accumulated way of these things, recorded in the permanent record that the subsequent biographers and historians and small readers of her letters continue to consult. The cage is open. The daughter is at peace. The world that produced her story is gone. The story remains. The small portraits of her by Gainsborough, by Reynolds, by the small subsequent small artists of the small late 18th century who painted her in the small variations of her small substantial beauty, hang in the small galleries and the small private collections that the small subsequent small d dispersals of the small Cavendish inheritance have produced. The small letters between her and her mother, and her sister, and her small substantial friends, are preserved in the small archives that the small subsequent small biographical research has consulted. She is, in the small accumulated way of these things, more present in the small modern world than she would have been if the small accidents of her small public position had not made her into the small documentary figure that the small documentary record preserves. She is gone. She is also, in the small accumulated small way of these things, still here. I will see you in the next one.